My son-in-law drained my daughter's credit, then demanded $200,000 for his dream home. He looked me in the eye and said I owed it to our family. I slid one single piece of paper across the table and watched him lose absolutely everything. My name is Nelson Wright. I am 69 years old, and for years I played the part of a poor retired carpenter living in a rundown house. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family member who underestimated your true worth. It had been 6 long months since I was allowed to see my own daughter. When the invitation for dinner finally came, I knew it was not born out of love or a sudden desire to reconnect. Gavin chose the most expensive steakhouse in the city. It was the kind of place where the waiters wear crisp white gloves and the menus do not list the prices. I arrived exactly on time wearing my worn corduroy jacket and practical work boots. The hostess looked at me with clear disdain before leading me to a secluded corner booth. The clinking of heavy silverware and soft jazz music faded into the background as I approached their table. Gavin was already seated with my daughter Camille. I barely recognized my own child. Camille used to be vibrant and full of life. Now she looked frail and exhausted. She sat with her shoulders hunched and her gaze firmly fixed on her empty porcelain plate. Her hands were visibly trembling under the table. She did not even look up to meet my eyes when I slid into the booth across from them. Gavin did not offer a handshake. He did not ask how my health was or how I was managing living alone. The moment I sat down, he reached into his designer leather briefcase and pulled out a thick roll of glossy architectural blueprints. He slammed them onto the center of the table right over the fine linen tablecloth. He tapped the blueprint with his expensive gold pen and looked at me with a cold, calculating stare. He stated that they were building a custom luxury home in a gated private community. He then ordered me to withdraw $200,000 from my retirement fund and transfer it to his account by Friday morning. He did not ask for a loan or offer a payment plan. He issued a direct command as if I were one of his subordinate employees who had no right to question his authority. I looked from the blueprints to Gavin. He sat there radiating an arrogant sense of absolute entitlement. He wore a tailored suit that cost more than some people earn in an entire month. He leaned back in his plush leather chair and began to lecture me. He used that specific, condescending tone reserved for people he deemed entirely beneath him. He told me that my house was practically falling apart in a terrible neighborhood and that I was an embarrassment to his professional image. He laughed and said an old black man like me did not need a retirement fund just to sit on a porch all day. He claimed his business was on the verge of a major breakthrough and this house would serve as the perfect headquarters to entertain his wealthy clients. He explicitly stated that I owed this money to his family. He told me it was my duty as a father to elevate my daughter from the modest life I had forced upon her during her childhood. He painted a picture of me as a failure who finally had a single chance to redeem himself by funding his lavish lifestyle. I listened to every single insulting word in total silence. I looked at Camille again. She flinched every time Gavin raised his voice but remained completely mute. She had been thoroughly manipulated and isolated from anyone who truly cared about her. Gavin continued his arrogant speech, boasting about the expensive cars he planned to buy and the exclusive country club memberships he would secure once they moved into this new house. He truly believed I was just a naive old carpenter clinging to a meager pension. He had absolutely no idea about the reality of my financial situation. When my beautiful wife Clarice was still alive, we made a conscious decision to live a quiet and frugal life. We invested every extra dollar into real estate and private funds. Clarice always told me that true power is silent. I currently owned commercial properties across the state and had a net worth in the millions. Gavin thought he was bullying a helpless old man out of his last pennies. He was completely unaware that he was trying to extort a man who could buy this entire restaurant and fire the staff before dessert even arrived. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of anger or frustration. My silence clearly unnerved him. Bullies like Gavin thrive on fear and desperation, but I offered him neither. I simply picked up my knife and fork and slowly finished my steak. I savored every bite while Gavin waited impatiently for my absolute submission. He tapped his fingers on the table, expecting me to break down and hand over my life savings to appease him. When I took my final sip of water, I carefully wiped my mouth with the linen napkin and placed it neatly next to my plate. I reached into my old, worn leather wallet and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. I placed it firmly on the table, making sure it covered the exact cost of my meal and a generous tip for the waiter. I folded my hands together and looked Gavin directly in his eyes. I kept my voice perfectly steady and utterly devoid of emotion. I told him that he would not receive a single cent from me. I told him my retirement funds were none of his business and that his dream house was his own financial problem to solve. I stated clearly that a real man provides for his own wife instead of begging his elderly father-in-law for a handout. Gavin blinked in absolute shock. He was completely unprepared for a firm and uncompromising refusal. He expected me to be intimidated by his expensive suit and his aggressive posturing. I turned my attention away from him and looked at my daughter. I softened my voice just for her. I told Camille that I loved her unconditionally and that my door would always be open for her whenever she decided she had enough of this charade. I told her she was raised to be a strong and independent woman and that she did not have to live in fear of anyone. Camille looked up at me for a fraction of a second. Her eyes were brimming with unshed tears. She opened her mouth to speak, but Gavin violently slammed his fist on the table, causing the expensive crystal glasses to rattle and spill water across his precious blueprints. Gavin leaned across the table with his face turning a dangerous shade of red. The veins in his neck bulged against his tight silk collar. He pointed a trembling finger right at my face and hissed his final threat. He declared that I was completely dead to them. He swore that I would never be allowed to see Camille again. He venomously added that when they eventually had children, I would be permanently barred from ever meeting my own grandchildren. He thought this emotional blackmail would finally break my resolve. He expected me to fall to my knees and beg for his forgiveness so I would not lose my only child. Instead, I stood up from the booth and looked down at him. A cold and detached smile formed on my lips. I did not argue or plead or raise my voice. I simply turned my back on him and walked out of the restaurant with my head held high. The cool night air hit my face as I stepped out onto the street. Gavin believed he had just punished me with ultimate isolation. He did not realize he had just signed his own financial death warrant. I knew exactly what I had to do next. The drive back to my neighborhood was completely silent. I did not turn on the radio. I did not shed a single tear. Men like Gavin do not deserve tears. They only deserve consequences. I parked my reliable old truck in the driveway of my modest single-story house. From the outside, it looked exactly like the home of a retired blue-collar worker living on a fixed income. The paint was slightly faded, and the wooden porch steps creaked under my heavy boots. That was precisely the illusion Clarice and I had carefully constructed decades ago. I walked through the quiet hallway and stepped into my dimly lit study. The air still carried a faint trace of Clarice and her favorite vanilla perfume. I stood in front of a large oil painting of my late wife. Her warm smile and sharp eyes seemed to encourage what I was about to do. Clarice had always warned me that Gavin was a parasite masked by a tailored suit. She saw right through his charming facade on the very first day Camille brought him home. I gently lifted the heavy wooden frame off its sturdy brass hooks and placed it carefully on my desk. Behind the beautiful portrait sat a heavy industrial steel wall safe. I reached out and entered the 6-digit combination. The heavy metal door clicked open with a satisfying mechanical thud. Inside were no dusty photo albums or sentimental trinkets. The safe contained the cold, hard evidence of my true financial empire. I reached past the commercial real estate deeds and the offshore investment portfolios. I pulled out a thick, dark blue binder. This was the most important file in the entire safe. This was the hidden mechanism that had been secretly keeping my daughter afloat. I sat down at my heavy oak desk and opened the blue binder under the glow of my brass reading lamp. Inside were years of meticulously organized financial records and bank transfer confirmations. For the past 3 years, I had been the invisible shield protecting Camille from the harsh reality of her husband's financial incompetence. When Gavin insisted that Camille quit her stable corporate job to help him build his supposed startup company, he promised to take care of all her needs. He bragged endlessly to our relatives about his immense success and his ability to provide for his wife. The truth was entirely different. Gavin was drowning in his own vanity. I knew Camille was struggling behind closed doors, so I took matters into my own hands. I established an anonymous corporate trust fund through a proxy shell company. Every single month, without fail, that trust fund quietly paid off her massive university student loans. Every month, it completely covered her premium tier health insurance. I even structured it to look like a prestigious ongoing alumni grant, so Camille would never suspect the money came directly from the old carpenter she had been isolated from. Gavin took full credit for their comfortable lifestyle. He drove leased luxury cars and wore expensive watches while I silently paid the foundational bills that kept them from plunging into absolute bankruptcy. He paraded around family gatherings acting like a superior self-made millionaire. He looked down his nose at me and mocked my worn boots, completely unaware that my hidden wealth was the only thing preventing his fragile house of cards from collapsing. He had the audacity to demand $200,000 from me tonight, claiming I owed him. He believed he was squeezing blood from a stone. He never realized he was actually biting the invisible hand that had been feeding him for 3 years. I looked at the most recent bank statement showing a massive payment made just 2 weeks ago to Camille and her loan provider. That was the last payment they would ever receive. I closed the blue binder with a sharp slap that echoed in the quiet room. I picked up my cell phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. It was nearly midnight, but I knew Jonathan Pierce would answer. Jonathan was my personal wealth manager and my lead attorney. He was a brilliant and utterly ruthless legal mind who handled my commercial real estate empire with absolute precision. He answered on the second ring with his usual crisp and alert tone. I did not waste any time with pleasantries. I told Jonathan to immediately access the Blue Trust Fund account. I gave him a direct and irrevocable order. I told him to freeze the entire account tonight. I instructed him to cancel every single automated transfer scheduled for the upcoming month. I wanted the health insurance premium payments completely halted. I wanted the student loan disbursements permanently revoked. I wanted the corporate shield dissolved so not a single penny would flow into Gavin and his household. Jonathan paused for a brief moment. He reminded me that cutting the health insurance and loan payments so abruptly would instantly trigger massive default notices. He warned me that Camille would receive aggressive collection calls within a matter of days. He asked if I was absolutely certain I wanted to subject my own daughter to that level of severe financial distress. I told Jonathan I had never been more certain of anything in my entire life. I explained that a parasite cannot be reasoned with. A parasite must be starved. As long as I kept secretly subsidizing their expenses, Gavin would continue to manipulate and isolate Camille. He would keep draining her spirit while living a lie funded by my hard work. Camille needed to experience the catastrophic failure of her husband's empty promises. She needed to witness his fake empire crumble to the ground so she could finally wake up from the nightmare she was living. Jonathan simply agreed and promised the freeze would be fully executed before the banks opened in the morning. I hung up the phone and placed it on my desk. The invisible financial bloodline that kept Gavin arrogant and comfortable was now officially severed. I turned off the reading lamp and sat in the dark room. I felt a profound sense of calm wash over me. The storm was coming and I was fully prepared for it. I managed to get a few hours of restful sleep before a loud noise shattered the quiet morning. My cell phone began ringing frantically on the nightstand. I glanced at the glowing digital clock. It was exactly 6 in the morning. I picked up the phone and saw an urgent caller identification from the Premier Fraud Division of my primary bank. I answered the call with a sudden sharpness in my chest. A highly concerned bank representative immediately verified my identity. She asked if I was currently attempting to authorize a massive financial transaction. I told her I was in bed and had authorized nothing. Her next words made the blood freeze in my veins. She informed me that someone had just tried to initiate an expedited digital mortgage application against my current residential property. The applicant had successfully bypassed the first layer of security by inputting my exact social security number, my full legal name, and my private date of birth. They were attempting to borrow $250,000 using my paid-off house as collateral. There was only one person desperate and arrogant enough to attempt such a brazen federal crime just hours after being denied cash. Gavin. I instructed the Bank Fraud Division to block the mortgage application immediately and log the exact IP address of the applicant. I did not involve the local police department just yet. A simple arrest for attempted identity theft was far too generous and far too fast for a man like Gavin. I needed to uncover the full unvarnished extent of his financial rot before I crushed his world completely. By 9 in the morning, I was sitting in a highly secured and soundproofed conference room on the top floor of Jonathan Pierce's downtown law firm. The expansive floor-to-ceiling glass windows overlooked the bustling city skyline, but my focus was entirely on the heavy mahogany table in front of us. Seated directly across from Jonathan and me was Marcus Thorne. Marcus was a former federal forensic accountant who now ran the most elite and discreet private investigation agency on the entire East Coast. He charged a massive premium for his specialized services, but he always delivered absolute, undeniable truth. Marcus did not offer any pleasant greetings or sympathetic apologies. He knew exactly why we were gathered there. He simply reached into his scuffed leather satchel and pulled out a thick stack of printed financial dossiers. He tossed the heavy pile of confidential credit statements directly onto the polished table with a dull thud. The documents slid across the smooth surface and stopped right in front of my hands. Marcus leaned back in his ergonomic chair and crossed his muscular arms. He stated plainly that Gavin was not the successful tech entrepreneur he pretended to be to my daughter and his peers. He told us that the flashy logistics startup company Gavin constantly bragged about had legally dissolved over 18 months ago due to a total lack of operating capital. The document sitting quietly in front of me contained the actual horrifying truth of how my son-in-law had been financing his arrogant and lavish lifestyle. I opened the first manila folder and began reading the meticulously highlighted bank records. The sheer magnitude of Gavin's deception made the air in the conference room feel dangerously thin. Gavin had absolutely zero legitimate income. His supposed revolutionary software company had never generated a single dollar in revenue or secured any actual client contracts. Instead of admitting failure and finding a real job, he had systematically turned his own wife into a human credit line. Marcus explained his methodology with cold and surgical precision. Gavin had secretly used Camille's excellent credit score to open 5 separate high-limit credit cards. He forged her digital signature on the banking applications and routed the electronic billing statements to a hidden email address he controlled so she would never see the mounting balances. Over the past 2 years, he had aggressively maxed out every single card to fund his daily illusion of extreme wealth. He used her good name to buy expensive tailored suits and to pay for extravagant business lunches with non-existent investors. He charged thousands of dollars at high-end electronics stores to buy the newest gadgets just to look the part of a successful executive at his rented co-working space. The total unsecured debt strapped directly to my daughter's name sat at exactly $80,000. But the financial abuse did not stop with the credit cards. I turned to the next page and saw the registration documents for the sleek imported European luxury sedan Gavin proudly drove to family events. He always claimed he bought it outright with his first big round of venture capital funding. The official motor vehicle registration clearly showed Camille was the sole legal owner and the primary borrower on the aggressive subprime loan terms. Marcus tapped the paper with his pen and informed me that the vehicle was currently 3 months past due on payments. The financing company had already issued a final warning default notice. They were actively preparing to send a commercial repossession team to tow the vehicle away. Gavin had effectively destroyed Camille's financial future. He had chained her to a sinking ship while he paraded around town acting like a self-made king. A deep and primal rage ignited in the dead center of my chest. It was the kind of blinding, uncontrollable fury a father feels when he realizes a predator has his child trapped in a dark cage. My large, calloused hands gripped the edges of the mahogany table so tightly my knuckles turned stark white. I wanted to leave the law firm drive directly to his expensive leased office and drag him out onto the busy street by his expensive silk collar. I wanted to show him exactly what a retired carpenter from a tough neighborhood does to a weak man who steals from his little girl. I wanted to make him bleed for every dollar he forced my daughter to owe. But I forced myself to inhale deeply and release the breath slowly through my nose. Acting on pure physical emotion would only give Gavin a victim narrative to spin to Camille. I could not just break his jaw. I had to surgically dismantle his entire existence so Camille could see his true monstrous nature for herself without any shadow of a doubt. I looked up from the catastrophic credit reports and met Jonathan's sharp, predatory gaze. Jonathan nodded silently, knowing exactly the kind of scorched earth warfare we were about to engage in. I turned my attention back to Marcus. I told the investigator that this level of casual sociopathic deception does not just develop overnight in a vacuum. A man who easily commits federal identity theft against his father-in-law and financial ruin against his own wife learned that highly manipulative behavior from somewhere. I ordered Marcus to expand the scope of his investigation immediately. I told him to stop looking just at Gavin and to start digging deep into the financial history of his entire family. I wanted comprehensive background checks on his arrogant parents and his siblings. I instructed Marcus to pull their historical tax records and search for any hidden bankruptcies or history of civil litigation. I wanted every shell company they ever registered and every property they ever claimed to own scrutinized under a microscope. I was willing to spend whatever it took to unearth the generational rot that produced a parasite like Gavin. Marcus wrote down the new aggressive directives with a grim smile. He promised to deploy his entire intelligence team and deliver the expanded family dossiers within 48 hours. I closed the heavy folders and thanked him for his excellent and thorough work. I was just preparing to leave the conference room to review my immediate legal options with Jonathan when a sudden sharp vibration against my chest interrupted the quiet room. I reached into my corduroy jacket pocket and pulled out my cell phone. The screen was flashing bright red with an urgent notification from the high-definition security system I had installed around my property years ago. A motion sensor at my front porch had just been heavily triggered. I tapped the screen to open the live encrypted video feed. The high-resolution camera captured Gavin standing aggressively on my front steps. He was furiously pounding his fist against my heavy oak door with wild impatience. He looked frantic and visibly angry, clearly unhinged by the total failure of his morning mortgage scheme and his sudden lack of liquid cash. But he was not standing on my porch alone. Standing right beside him was a strange, older white man dressed in a cheap, ill-fitting gray suit holding a leather clipboard. The stranger was carefully examining the exterior architecture of my house and making notes. Gavin had actually brought an uninvited real estate appraiser to my private property. I left Jonathan in the conference room and drove back to my neighborhood faster than I had in 20 years. By the time I pulled my truck into the rear alley and slipped quietly through the kitchen door, Gavin was still aggressively hammering his fist against the front porch wood. I walked calmly down the hallway and unlocked the heavy deadbolt. I pulled the oak door open just as he raised his fist to strike it again. Gavin did not flinch or offer an apology for trespassing on my land. He immediately shoved his expensive leather loafer into the doorframe to prevent me from closing it. He jutted his chin toward the sweaty man standing next to him and arrogantly introduced him as a certified independent property appraiser. Gavin did not beat around the bush or pretend this was a friendly family visit. He stated that since his morning mortgage application encountered a technical glitch, he had decided on a much faster route to secure his dream home. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick stack of pre-drafted real estate transfer documents. He shoved a silver pen toward my chest and demanded I sign the papers right there on the porch to initiate a rapid cash sale of my property. He claimed the house was too big and dangerous for a man of my age to maintain alone. He spoke with a sickeningly sweet customer service voice for the benefit of the appraiser, but his eyes were completely dead and entirely focused on my signature. He wanted to strip the roof right over my head to fund a mansion he could never afford. I looked down at the silver pen and then back up at his flushed face. I told him quietly but firmly to remove his expensive shoe from my doorframe and to get off my property immediately. The polite facade vanished in a single second. Gavin sneered and violently shoved his weight against the heavy oak door, forcing it wide open. He stepped aggressively into my foyer, invading my personal space with the sheer physical entitlement of a man who had never faced a real consequence in his entire life. The appraiser shifted uncomfortably on the porch, but Gavin ignored him entirely. He leaned down directly into my face so close I could smell the stale coffee and sharp mints on his breath. He dropped his voice into a vicious, threatening hiss. He told me that if I did not sign the transfer documents right now, he would call the police and have me forcibly removed from my own home. He declared he would contact the state authorities and testify under oath that I was suffering from severe dementia and extreme financial paranoia. He threatened to drag me into a courtroom and have a judge lock me away in a miserable state-run nursing home where I would rot in a wheelchair for the rest of my miserable life. He promised to take full legal guardianship over my life and drain every single asset I owned while I withered away in a sterile hospital bed. He looked at me with absolute contempt, treating me not as a human being or his father-in-law, but as a stubborn object standing between him and his country club lifestyle. He genuinely believed that because I wore faded flannel and lived quietly, I possessed no social power and no legal recourse to fight back. He thought the systemic power dynamics of the world were entirely on his side, and that I would simply bow my head and surrender my lifelong sanctuary to avoid a public confrontation. He expected fear to break my spirit and force my compliance. He expected me to crumble under the sheer weight of his aggressive white-collar authority. He expected an easy victory over a tired old man. I did not raise my hands to defend myself. I did not shout or curse or give him the satisfying emotional reaction he was desperately trying to provoke. Instead, I simply clasped my hands calmly behind my back and took one deliberate step backward deeper into the hallway. It was a precise and highly calculated movement. By stepping back, I forced Gavin to lean further into the house and directly into the optimal focal range of the hidden high-definition security camera embedded flawlessly inside the hallway smoke detector. The encrypted lens captured every single detail of his contorted face and his aggressive posture. The sensitive multi-directional microphones recorded every vicious syllable of his threats to falsely imprison me in a medical facility. I let him talk. I let him dig his own legal grave with his own arrogant tongue. The real estate appraiser standing outside finally realized he was an accessory to a felony in progress. The sweaty man nervously cleared his throat, backed away down the porch steps, and practically ran toward his parked sedan without saying a single word. Gavin realized his audience had fled and briefly turned his head toward the street. That split second of distraction was all I needed. I stepped forward with a sudden burst of physical power he completely underestimated. I grabbed the heavy brass handle and forcefully slammed the solid oak door directly in his face. The heavy wood struck his shoulder and pushed him backward over the threshold. I threw the deadbolt, locked the heavy chain, and engaged the reinforced steel security bar in one smooth motion. Gavin began screaming obscenities through the thick wood, kicking the bottom of the door like a spoiled toddler throwing a tantrum. I stood in the quiet hallway listening to him rage until he finally realized he was utterly defeated. His car tires screeched against the asphalt as he drove away in a fury. I walked into my study and downloaded the pristine video footage of his extortion attempt, sending it directly to Jonathan's secure server. He had given me the exact ammunition I needed to utterly destroy him in any court of law. I poured myself a glass of iced tea and sat in my armchair, letting the absolute silence of my fortress wash over me. The trap was set, and the predator had willingly walked right into the steel jaws. Exactly 2 hours later, the front doorbell chimed with a sharp, demanding ring. I glanced at the security monitor, expecting Gavin to have returned with another foolish scheme or a pair of hired thugs to finish his dirty work. But the screen showed something entirely different. Standing on my porch were a man and a woman wearing crisp municipal uniforms with official state badges clipped to their lapels. They carried heavy clipboards and wore expressions of deep institutional concern. They were not police officers responding to a noise complaint. They were senior field agents from Adult Protective Services. I unlatched the deadbolt and opened the door to greet them. The woman introduced herself firmly and stated they were responding to an emergency familial tip regarding my immediate physical safety and mental decline. She looked at me with clinical pity and informed me that my son-in-law had filed a sworn legal affidavit just 1 hour ago. Gavin had officially reported to the state that I was suffering from severe unmedicated schizophrenia and aggressive dementia and required immediate psychiatric institutionalization. I did not react with the defensive panic or aggressive confusion they were clearly trained to expect from a genuinely unwell patient. I simply unlatched the deadbolt and opened the heavy oak door completely wide. I gestured politely with a steady hand and invited both state agents inside my home. I offered them a seat in my immaculately clean living room and asked if they preferred Earl Grey or chamomile tea. The male agent exchanged a brief, surprised glance with his female partner. They had arrived expecting a chaotic hoarding situation or a confused old man wandering aimlessly in his pajamas. Instead, they found a sharply dressed homeowner standing in a dust-free hallway with the faint smell of lemon polish lingering in the air. I walked into my kitchen and prepared a fresh pot of tea with absolute mechanical precision. My hands did not shake or fumble as I carried the silver tray holding 3 porcelain cups directly to the coffee table. I sat down opposite them in my favorite armchair, keeping my posture impeccably straight. I spoke with the calm and measured cadence of a man who was entirely in control of his mental faculties. I asked them to explain the exact nature of the sworn affidavit my son-in-law had filed against me. The female agent cleared her throat and awkwardly read from her clipboard. She detailed Gavin's fabricated claims of me wandering the streets at night, forgetting my own name, and acting violently toward family members. I listened to every single ridiculous lie without interrupting her once. I took a slow sip of my hot tea and placed the cup gently on its saucer. I told them I understood they were just doing their jobs protecting vulnerable seniors, but they had been deliberately weaponized by a desperate fraud. I stood up and walked over to my heavy oak desk. I pulled out a meticulously organized leather portfolio and placed it directly on the coffee table right next to their teacups. I opened the first tab and slid my comprehensive annual medical evaluations toward the agents. The reports were less than 2 weeks old and signed by the chief of neurology at the most prestigious hospital in the state. The medical documents explicitly confirmed I possessed the cognitive function of a man 20 years my junior, with absolutely zero markers for cognitive decline, dementia, or any psychiatric disorders. Next, I produced my personal accounting ledger. It was a flawless printed spreadsheet tracking every single utility bill, grocery receipt, and property tax payment rounded to the exact penny. I explained that a man suffering from severe unmedicated schizophrenia does not balance a complex financial portfolio with such surgical precision. The agents scanned the paperwork with widening eyes. Their initial clinical pity was rapidly transforming into profound professional embarrassment. But I was not finished dismantling Gavin's pathetic narrative. I picked up my tablet and synced it to the flat-screen television mounted on the living room wall. I pressed play on the high-definition security footage captured just 2 hours prior. The crisp audio of Gavin screaming obscenities and threatening to lock me in a nursing home echoed through my quiet living room. The agents watched in absolute stunned silence as the arrogant man who had filed the protective order was recorded violently kicking my front door and demanding my signature on a fraudulent real estate transfer. The video definitively proved who the actual threat was. I paused the footage right on Gavin's contorted, enraged face. I looked at the two state employees and calmly stated that this was not a medical emergency, but a documented case of attempted elder financial exploitation and criminal extortion. I asked them if this footage was sufficient to close their investigation. The male agent wrote furiously on his notepad, while the female agent stared at the frozen image of Gavin on my television screen. They had seen financial abuse before, but rarely with such undeniable, high-definition proof handed to them on a silver platter. I told them that Gavin was drowning in his own debt and was trying to use their state agency as a weapon to steal my house. The female agent closed her heavy clipboard with a sharp, decisive snap. Her face flushed a deep shade of crimson as she realized the massive deception her office had just been dragged into. She offered a profuse and completely sincere apology on behalf of the state agency. The male agent shook his head in absolute disgust at the video screen. He assured me that they would immediately close the active file and officially categorize Gavin's malicious report as completely unfounded and intentionally fraudulent. He even offered to forward their internal findings to the local police department to assist me in filing a formal harassment complaint against my son-in-law. I thanked them for their diligence and stood up to politely escort them to the front door. As I began gathering the thick stack of medical and financial documents from the coffee table, I executed my next calculated maneuver. I deliberately let a dense commercial real estate lease agreement slip from the back of my portfolio. The heavy parchment paper landed squarely on top of my medical files, right in the direct line of sight of the male agent. The bold black header of the document clearly identified my private shell company as the sole legal owner of a premium downtown commercial plaza. The tenant's signature at the very bottom of the highlighted page belonged exclusively to Gavin Foster. It was the exact building where Gavin operated his fake logistics startup to impress my daughter and his wealthy peers. The agent's eyes lingered on the commercial document for a fraction of a second before he quickly looked away, trying to respect my privacy. But he saw exactly what I wanted him to see. He realized he was not just standing in the living room of an innocent victim. He was standing in the home of a highly capable landlord who literally owned the ground beneath the predator's feet. The agent shook my hand with a newfound layer of deep respect and quietly exited my house. I locked the deadbolt behind them and walked back to my desk. Gavin wanted to play a high-stakes game with real estate and legal threats. He had absolutely no idea I controlled the entire board. I sat down in my leather armchair and smoothed out the commercial lease agreement on my desk. My private shell company possessed an ironclad clause allowing immediate rent adjustments for month-to-month tenants holding expired long-term leases. Gavin was so financially incompetent he had let his original lease expire 6 months ago and was currently operating on an unprotected rolling agreement. I uncapped my favorite fountain pen and drafted a formal notice of rent adjustment. I legally increased his monthly commercial rent by exactly 300% effective immediately upon receipt. I signed the bottom of the aggressive document with a bold, sweeping stroke. I scanned the notice into my secure server and emailed it directly to my property management proxy with strict instructions to hand-deliver it to Gavin's front desk before lunch. The financial bloodline had already been severed. Now it was time to actively crush him under the weight of his own arrogant vanity. The real storm was officially beginning. The courier delivered the thick envelope to Gavin's leased office exactly at noon. When he tore open the certified letter and read the bold print detailing the 300% rent increase, his carefully constructed reality completely fractured. He did not possess the funds to cover his current reduced rent, let alone a massively inflated commercial lease. He swept everything off his glass desk in a blind rage. The facade of the composed tech entrepreneur vanished entirely, leaving only a cornered and vicious animal. Gavin left his office in ruins and sped back to the upscale townhouse he was currently failing to pay for. He burst through the front door and unleashed his profound humiliation directly onto the only person he still believed he could control. He found Camille in the living room and immediately began screaming accusations at her. He blamed her for his failures. He blamed her family for his sudden financial crises. He grabbed a heavy crystal vase from the entryway table and hurled it violently against the hardwood floor. The shattering glass echoed through the large empty house. Camille retreated into a corner, terrified by the sudden and explosive physical violence. Gavin did not stop there. He demanded her cell phone and her entire wallet. He snatched the devices and the plastic cards right out of her trembling hands. He told her she was entirely forbidden from contacting anyone outside of the house. He locked the front door from the inside and shoved the keys deep into his pocket. He stripped her of her communication and her financial access, leaving her a prisoner in her own home. The evening had settled into a quiet and familiar rhythm inside my house. I was sitting in my modest workshop in the garage, carefully polishing a vintage wooden rocking chair. The repetitive motion of the oil-soaked rag against the rich mahogany wood grounded me. It was a simple task that required focus and patience. The intense events of the morning had passed, but I knew the shock waves were currently ripping through Gavin's life. The sudden shrill ring of the kitchen landline broke the comfortable silence of my workshop. Very few people ever called that old rotary phone. I wiped the dark wood oil from my hands using a rag and walked slowly into the kitchen. I lifted the heavy receiver and brought it to my ear. I did not speak immediately. I waited for the caller to identify themselves. The line crackled with static and the distant muffled sounds of evening traffic. Then I heard a sound that made the blood freeze in my veins. It was a jagged, breathless sob. It was the undeniable sound of my little girl crying. Camille spoke my name in a fragile, shattered whisper. I gripped the telephone cord tightly. She told me she had slipped out of the townhouse through the back patio door while Gavin was pacing upstairs. She had run 3 miles in the dark without a jacket or a phone. She had used a handful of loose change she found at the bottom of her coat pocket to dial my number from a dirty public payphone outside a late-night supermarket on the edge of her neighborhood. Her voice shook with a profound and exhausting terror. She told me Gavin had lost his mind completely. She described the shattered glass on the floor and the wild look in his eyes. She sobbed into the receiver and admitted she was terrified to go back to that house. She finally asked me to come get her. She asked her father to save her from the man who had promised to protect her. I did not ask Camille for any more details. I did not waste time offering empty words of comfort over a crackling telephone line. I simply told her to stay exactly where she was and to keep herself hidden in the shadows near the entrance. I hung up the heavy receiver with a sharp click. As I turned toward the hallway, the memory of my late wife Clarice washed over me. Her voice echoed clearly in the quiet kitchen. I remembered the exact night we brought Camille home from the hospital wrapped in a soft pink blanket. Clarice had looked up at me with fierce protective eyes and told me that our only job in this world was to ensure no one ever broke our daughter's spirit. She told me that a father's love is not just about providing shelter, but about becoming an absolute fortress when the wolves come circling. The wolves had not just circled my daughter, they had breached her home. I grabbed my heavy coat and snatched the keys to my truck from the brass hook by the door. I did not bother locking the deadbolt behind me. The time for calculated legal maneuvers and slow financial strangulation was temporarily suspended. This was no longer about property deeds or frozen trust funds. This was about the immediate physical safety of my child. I climbed into the cab of my truck and fired up the engine. The heavy tires peeled out of my driveway and hit the asphalt with aggressive force. I drove through the dark city streets with a cold and singular focus. I ignored the changing traffic lights and pushed the old engine to its absolute limit. The street lamps blurred into streaks of yellow light across my windshield. My mind was empty of anger and devoid of fear. I operated entirely on primal instinct. Every second that passed felt like a heavy weight pressing against my chest. I navigated the familiar route toward the upscale neighborhood where Gavin had isolated her. I visualized the exact location of the supermarket payphone she had described. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my forearms ached. The bright neon signs of the 24-hour supermarket cut through the darkness as I rounded the final corner. I spotted the illuminated bank of payphones near the far edge of the empty parking lot. I slammed my heavy boot down on the brake pedal. The truck skidded to a harsh and abrupt halt right in front of the concrete curb. I threw the transmission into park and shoved the heavy driver's side door open before the vehicle even settled. I stepped out into the cool night air, ready to pull my daughter into the safety of my truck. Instead, I was instantly blinded. Two incredibly bright tactical flashlights cut through the darkness and shined directly into my eyes. I raised my arm to shield my face from the blinding glare. As my vision adjusted to the harsh white light, my stomach dropped. Camille was standing behind the payphone, completely paralyzed with fear. Standing directly between my truck and my daughter was Gavin. He was not alone. Flanking him on either side were two fully uniformed patrol police officers with their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. Gavin pointed a trembling finger right at my chest and smiled a cold, triumphant smile. The harsh glare of the police flashlights pinned me against the side of my truck. I raised my hands slowly, keeping my palms completely open and visible to the two officers. Standing just a few feet away, Gavin quickly shifted his posture. The violent, enraged monster who had smashed crystal vases and locked my daughter in her own home vanished in an absolute instant. In his place stood the flawless picture of a deeply concerned and emotionally exhausted husband. He stepped slightly in front of Camille, acting as a physical shield between her and me. He spoke to the officers in a trembling, hushed tone that was sickeningly convincing. He told them that his wife was suffering from a severe psychological breakdown. He spun a horrific and detailed lie right in front of my face, claiming that she had been experiencing violent paranoid delusions and had wandered off into the freezing night during a manic episode. He pointed a trembling finger at me and told the police that her estranged and mentally unstable father had tracked her down and was attempting to forcibly kidnap her against her will. Camille stood frozen behind the broad shoulders of the police officers. She looked so incredibly small, wrapped in a thin, oversized cardigan, shivering violently in the cold night air. She kept her eyes glued to the asphalt, completely terrified of the brutal consequences if she dared to contradict Gavin in front of the authorities. Gavin placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, playing the part of the devoted savior. He told the officers that I had been harassing them relentlessly for weeks, and that my sudden aggressive appearance here was undeniable proof of my dangerous obsession. He was expertly weaponizing the local police department to maintain absolute control over his victim. One of the patrol officers stepped forward with his hand resting firmly on his heavy utility belt. He instructed me in a stern, authoritative voice to step back away from my vehicle and keep my distance from the couple. Every protective instinct in my body screamed at me to walk right past that officer, grab Gavin by his expensive silk collar, and drag my daughter into the safety of my truck. I wanted to loudly declare that this man was a massive fraud and a financial abuser who had stolen her phone and driven her out into the dark. But I remained absolutely still. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer a frantic defense or try to plead my case to the patrolman. I am a 69-year-old black man standing in a poorly lit supermarket parking lot at midnight, facing two armed police officers and a wealthy-looking white man crying wolf. I know exactly how the brutal rules of this society operate. I know the unforgiving mathematics of a midnight confrontation on the street. If I shouted or displayed even a fraction of the righteous anger burning in my chest, I would instantly validate Gavin's fabricated narrative. The officers would not see a desperate father trying to save his terrified little girl. They would only see a hostile and erratic aggressor who needed to be physically subdued and placed in cold steel handcuffs. If I was arrested for disorderly conduct or assaulting a police officer, I would lose my ability to fight for Camille in the morning. Gavin was counting on my rage. He was baiting a highly calculated trap, hoping I would lose my temper and give him the exact legal ammunition he desperately needed to finalize his victim narrative. He wanted me locked in a holding cell so he could drag Camille back to his personal prison without any outside interference. I refused to give him that satisfaction. I slowly lowered my hands and took 2 deliberate steps backward, demonstrating my complete physical compliance with the officer's commands. I kept my breathing steady and my facial expression completely neutral. The officers visibly relaxed their posture, recognizing that I was not a physical threat to anyone. I ignored the police officers completely and focused my attention entirely on my daughter. Camille finally lifted her heavy head, and our eyes met across the cold expanse of the parking lot. In that fleeting second, I poured every ounce of a father's fierce love and relentless determination into my gaze. I did not need to speak a single word out loud for her to understand my silent message. My eyes told her that I was not abandoning her to the wolves. I was simply retreating to a better tactical vantage point to win this entire war. I needed her to hold on just a little bit longer. I needed her to play along with his twisted psychological game for just a few more hours while I systematically dismantled the rest of his pathetic empire. A subtle but unmistakable shift happened in Camille's pale expression. The sheer panic in her wide eyes slowly dissolved into a quiet, enduring strength. She understood exactly what I was doing. She knew her father had never backed down from a real fight in his entire life, and he certainly was not going to start backing down tonight. I turned my attention back to the officer in charge. I gave him a curt, respectful nod, acknowledging his authority over the current situation. I told him in a calm, measured voice that there had clearly been a family misunderstanding and that I would be leaving the premises immediately to avoid causing any further distress to my daughter. I did not look at Gavin. I completely denied him the satisfaction of an angry glare or a parting verbal threat. I simply turned around, climbed back into the cab of my sturdy old truck, and started the heavy engine. As I pulled out of the parking lot and drove under the bright glow of the streetlights, I glanced in my rearview mirror. Gavin was standing near the curb watching my taillights disappear into the dark night. His posture had changed entirely. The smug, triumphant smirk had vanished from his face, replaced by a look of profound and unsettling confusion. He expected a screaming match. He expected a violent physical struggle. My cold, calculated retreat rattled him to his very core because he realized he had absolutely no idea what I was going to do next. The bright morning sun streamed through the heavy blinds of my study, casting long shadows across my solid oak desk. I had been awake for hours, meticulously reviewing the financial dossiers Marcus had provided. At exactly 8 in the morning, the heavy brass knocker on my front door echoed through the quiet house. I opened the door to find Jonathan Pierce standing on my porch holding a thick manila envelope. My lawyer did not bother with his usual polite morning pleasantries. He walked straight past me into my study and threw the heavy stack of legal documents directly onto my desk with a loud, harsh slap. Jonathan looked at me with cold, predatory eyes and told me the opening bell had officially rung. Gavin had not wasted a single second after leaving the supermarket parking lot. He had bypassed the social workers entirely and gone straight to the judicial system. Jonathan informed me that Gavin had just filed an aggressive emergency petition in family court, explicitly demanding absolute legal guardianship over me and total control of my entire financial estate. I looked down at the thick legal petition Jonathan had just slammed onto my desk. Gavin was officially demanding full control of my life and my assets. He claimed I was a severe danger to myself and completely unfit to manage my own estate. He wanted a judge to hand him the keys to my kingdom so he could legally plunder everything I had built over a lifetime. Jonathan stood across from me waiting for my reaction. He expected outrage or panic, but I felt absolutely nothing but cold and focused resolve. I did not flinch. I picked up the stack of papers and dropped them directly into my wastebasket. I told Jonathan that playing defense was officially over. It was time to go on the offensive and annihilate Gavin completely. I instructed my lawyer to access a highly restricted offshore account. It was a secure vault holding a mere fraction of my $5 million secret portfolio, but it was more than enough to fund a massive legal war. I commanded Jonathan to hire the most elite and ruthless forensic accounting firm on the entire East Coast. I did not care what their hourly rate was or how many agents they needed to deploy. I wanted a team of financial assassins who could track a single dollar bill across the globe. I told Jonathan to unleash them on Gavin. I wanted every single bank account, shell company, and hidden transaction tied to that man ripped open and laid bare under a microscope. Jonathan smiled a sharp and predatory smile. He pulled his phone from his pocket and made the call before he even left my study. The absolute best financial hunters in the country were now officially on my payroll. The forensic accounting team operated with terrifying speed and surgical precision. Within 48 hours, they had bypassed the superficial credit card debt Marcus had already uncovered and dug straight into the darkest corners of Gavin's financial history. They bypassed the standard bank reports and infiltrated the encrypted layers of his failed business ventures. The lead accountant summoned Jonathan and me back to the downtown conference room to present their findings. He displayed a complex web of transactions on the large screen detailing a staggering level of criminal desperation. Gavin had not just ruined my daughter's credit score by opening unauthorized credit cards. He had actively endangered her physical safety. The forensic team discovered a series of ghost loans registered under completely fake corporate entities. When traditional banks finally cut him off, Gavin had turned to the unregulated underworld. He had forged Camille's signature on a stack of high-interest predatory loan agreements from dangerous and violent loan sharks. He had effectively used my innocent daughter as collateral to secure fast cash from dangerous men who do not send collection letters through the mail but instead send men to break doors down. Gavin had placed a massive target directly on Camille's back, just to maintain the pathetic illusion of his wealthy lifestyle. He bought expensive watches and leased luxury cars with money borrowed from criminals, while leaving his wife entirely legally responsible for the catastrophic fallout. Listening to the accountant explain the sheer magnitude of this betrayal made the air in the room feel heavy and suffocating. My initial rage instantly crystallized into pure ice. Gavin was not just a lazy opportunist or a bad husband. He was a reckless coward who willingly threw the woman he swore to protect directly to the wolves to save his own skin. He had absolutely no moral boundaries and no sense of humanity. I stared at the forged signatures on the screen, mapping out exactly how I would use these documents to ensure he never saw the light of day again. But the accounting team was not finished. The lead investigator switched the slide on the screen and warned me that the worst discovery was yet to come. The accountant pulled up a completely different set of financial records. These documents were much older, dating back exactly 5 years. Following my previous instructions to investigate Gavin's entire family tree, the forensic team had audited the historical tax returns and bank statements of his parents. What they uncovered was a sickening pattern of serial predation. Gavin was not a first-time offender driven to desperation by a failing startup. He was a professional con artist who specifically targeted the elderly. 5 years ago, Gavin had convinced his own mother to grant him limited financial power of attorney under the guise of managing her retirement portfolio. He promised to invest her hard-earned pension into high-yield accounts to secure her future. Instead, he systematically and mercilessly drained her entire life savings. The accountants traced the flow of money directly from his mother's retirement accounts into his own personal checking accounts. He had embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars from the woman who raised him, leaving her financial security completely devastated. When the money ran out, he simply covered his tracks with fake investment reports and moved on to his next target. He relied entirely on the toxic combination of family loyalty and deep personal shame. He knew his mother would be too humiliated and too heartbroken to ever report her own son to the federal authorities for financial crimes. She swallowed the massive loss to protect his reputation and to avoid a public scandal in her wealthy social circle. Gavin had learned exactly how to manipulate the elderly and exploit familial bonds without facing any legal consequences. This was his established blueprint. He drained his mother dry, and when he needed a new victim, he sought out Camille. He isolated her, married her, and immediately set his sights on me. He assumed I was just another gullible old parent he could easily bulldoze and discard. He thought his proven system of aggressive psychological manipulation and forged legal documents would work flawlessly a second time. He had absolutely no idea that he had finally picked the wrong target. I was not going to hide in shame, and I was certainly not going to protect his reputation. I stared at the undeniable proof of his 5-year-old embezzlement scheme. I realized that Gavin's mother had to know the truth about what her son really was. She was simply choosing to protect a monster to preserve her pristine social image. I reached across the heavy mahogany table and picked up the thick premium dossier containing every single forged check and stolen retirement transfer. I secured the folder under my arm and thanked the forensic team for their exceptional work. I put on my corduroy jacket, walked out of Jonathan's office, and took the elevator straight down to the parking garage. I climbed into my sturdy old truck and started the engine. I did not drive back to my quiet neighborhood. I steered my truck toward the highway and drove directly toward the manicured gates of the most expensive and exclusive suburb in the state. I had a scheduled afternoon appointment to keep. I was going to pay a very personal visit to Gavin's mother. The iron gates of the exclusive neighborhood swung open after I provided my name to the private security guard. I drove my weathered truck down the pristine tree-lined streets and parked directly in front of a sprawling manicured estate. I walked up the wide stone steps and rang the polished brass doorbell. A few moments later, the heavy door opened to reveal Mrs. Foster. Gavin's mother, was a woman who practically radiated generational arrogance. She was dressed in flawless designer clothes and wore a heavy pearl necklace that caught the afternoon sun. She looked past my shoulder at my old truck parked in her pristine driveway with obvious distaste. She did not offer a polite greeting or invite me inside with any warmth. She reluctantly stepped aside and led me into a pristine, formal living room filled with expensive art and delicate glass furniture. Before I could even sit down, she immediately launched into a fierce defense of her son. She crossed her arms and spoke to me with a sharp, condescending tone. She claimed that Gavin was a brilliant and exhausted entrepreneur who was being unfairly dragged down by my daughter. She accused Camille of being financially irresponsible and emotionally unstable. She firmly stated that Gavin was a saint for putting up with my family and that my sudden refusal to help fund his new real estate venture was incredibly selfish. She stood there protecting her precious son, wrapping him in a flawless narrative of victimhood and superiority. She genuinely believed that her aggressive posture would intimidate me into silence and submission. I did not argue with her. I did not raise my voice to defend my daughter or defend my own honor. Arguing with a delusion only validates it. Instead, I calmly unbuttoned my corduroy jacket and reached for the thick forensic dossier tucked securely under my arm. I stepped forward and tossed the heavy file directly onto the center of her immaculate glass coffee table. The loud slap of the thick paper against the glass silenced her mid-sentence. I looked her dead in the eye and told her that the time for protecting a predator was over. I instructed her to open the file and look at the highlighted pages. Mrs. Foster glared at me with deep indignation, but her curiosity forced her to reach down and open the heavy cover. She expected to see false accusations or fabricated police reports. Instead, she was met with the absolute, undeniable reality of her own deeply guarded shame. She stared at the crisp banking records from 5 years ago. She saw the exact dates and the exact dollar amounts meticulously tracking the systematic draining of her entire life savings. I watched the arrogant color completely drain from her face as she turned the pages with trembling fingers. She saw the high-resolution copies of the forged checks bearing the fraudulent signatures her own son had used to siphon her pension into his personal accounts. Her condescending facade shattered into a million irreparable pieces right in front of me. The polished high society matriarch suddenly looked incredibly small and utterly broken. She collapsed onto the edge of her expensive silk sofa, clutching the forensic documents to her chest. She began to sob uncontrollably. It was not a cry of simple sadness. It was the visceral, agonizing realization that her son was a remorseless monster. She had suffered in absolute silence for 5 years, swallowing her financial devastation to protect his public image and preserve her own pride. She thought he had learned his lesson. She thought his marriage to Camille was a fresh start. Seeing the undeniable proof that he was currently executing the exact same predatory blueprint on my daughter destroyed her final illusion. She wept for the son she wished she had and the criminal she actually raised. The agonizing sobs eventually subsided, leaving behind a cold and hardening silence in the immaculate living room. I watched Mrs. Foster slowly wipe the ruined makeup from her face with a trembling hand. The deep sorrow in her eyes rapidly crystallized into a bitter, burning resentment. She realized that her years of painful silence had not protected a misguided son, but had simply enabled a ruthless predator to find his next innocent victim. Her fierce maternal loyalty evaporated entirely, replaced by a venomous fury directed at the man who had effortlessly betrayed her trust twice. She stood up from the silk sofa with a sudden, rigid determination. She did not speak a single word to me. She simply turned her back and marched briskly down the long hallway toward her private study. I waited in the living room listening to the heavy metallic clank of a secure wall safe being opened and closed. When she returned, her hands were tightly gripping a thick linen folder stamped with the gold crest of a premier luxury real estate brokerage. She walked directly up to me and shoved the heavy folder aggressively into my chest. She told me in a hoarse, shattered whisper that Gavin had visited her just a few days ago. He had arrogantly bragged about securing his ultimate dream home and had asked her to lock the original physical contracts in her secure safe until the final closing date. She admitted she had never bothered to read the documents, assuming it was a legitimate purchase for his future with Camille. Her voice shook with absolute disgust as she told me to take the papers and use them to destroy him completely. She was officially washing her hands of the monster she had brought into the world. I took the heavy linen folder and opened the thick cover. Inside was the fully executed purchase agreement, for the exact $200,000 luxury property Gavin had demanded I finance at the steakhouse. I flipped past the architectural rendering and the aggressive closing timelines straight to the final signature page. I scanned the rigid legal text detailing the primary buyers of the massive estate. Gavin's name was printed in bold, dark ink right at the top of the ownership declaration. I moved my finger down to the co-owner designation, fully expecting to see Camille's name forged alongside his. My heart stopped dead in my chest. The second name legally bound to the luxurious property did not belong to my daughter. The signature glaring back at me belonged to a completely unknown woman. Gavin was not just exploiting my retirement fund to elevate his marital status. He was actively attempting to steal my life savings to purchase a hidden love nest for his secret mistress, while leaving Camille trapped under a mountain of dangerous underworld debt. I closed the folder with a sharp snap. The war had just reached a terrifying new level. The name printed next to Gavin's bold signature belonged to Morgan. I recognized that name immediately from the comprehensive background checks Marcus had compiled just days earlier. Morgan was the young receptionist who worked at the front desk of Gavin's leased commercial office. She was not a wealthy co-investor or a legitimate business partner. She was a 24-year-old secretary. Gavin was actively engaged in a sordid affair with his own employee right under everyone's nose. The absolute depth of his depravity was utterly staggering. He had brought his arrogant demands to that expensive steakhouse fully intending to extort $200,000 from me. He wanted my hard-earned retirement savings to purchase a luxurious suburban love nest for his young mistress. Meanwhile, he had already shackled my innocent daughter to $80,000 in high-interest predatory loans. He was systematically destroying Camille's financial identity and her credit score to fund his legitimate marital facade while simultaneously building an entirely new hidden life with another woman using my money. He planned to leave Camille completely bankrupt and legally responsible for the violent underworld debt he had recklessly accrued. He would simply walk away into his pristine new mansion with his secretary, leaving his wife to be hunted by dangerous loan sharks. The sheer audacity of his scheme was breathtaking. He believed he was the smartest man in any room, playing a high-stakes game with our lives, treating us like disposable chess pieces. I walked out of his mother's house holding the folder tightly against my chest and drove straight back to my secure study. I needed to deliver this catastrophic truth to Camille, but I knew a direct, aggressive confrontation would trigger her deeply ingrained defensive trauma responses. I had to let her discover the betrayal completely on her own terms. I called Marcus and issued a new, highly specific directive. I needed undeniable visual proof of Gavin's affair to accompany the real estate contract. Marcus deployed his best surveillance team to the commercial plaza the very next morning. By noon, they sent me a dozen high-resolution photographs of Gavin and Morgan. The images were absolutely damning and left zero room for misinterpretation. They showed the pair standing inside the glass-walled lobby of the luxury real estate brokerage. Gavin had his arms wrapped tightly around her waist, pulling her in for a passionate and undeniable kiss right in the middle of the busy office. I printed the clearest photograph on high-quality glossy paper. I did not drive to Camille's house to hand her the evidence personally. If I presented the documents myself, Gavin would inevitably twist the narrative. He would convince her that her estranged and paranoid father was fabricating evidence to destroy their marriage. He had spent years deliberately conditioning her to doubt her own reality and trust only his version of the truth. The evidence had to bypass his psychological blockade completely. I took the glossy photograph and the copied real estate purchase agreement and placed them inside a sleek black gift box. I added no handwritten note and no return address. I wanted the cold, hard facts to speak entirely for themselves. I hired an independent bonded courier service with strict instructions to deliver the package directly to Camille's desk at her new temporary administrative job. I explicitly mandated that the courier require her personal signature so Gavin could not intercept the delivery at their townhouse. I tracked the delivery vehicle through the city streets using the encrypted GPS link provided by the courier company. I watched the digital marker stop outside the corporate building where my daughter was currently working a low-level clerical job just to keep her head above water. The courier confirmed the delivery was successful at exactly 2 in the afternoon. The explosive package was securely in her hands. I sat back in my leather armchair, folded my hands, and waited for the inevitable detonation. Inside the sterile break room of her corporate office, Camille untied the silver ribbon and opened the sleek black box. She expected a corporate gift or a misdelivered package. Instead, she found the sharp, glossy photograph staring right back at her. She saw her husband passionately kissing his young receptionist inside a real estate office. She lifted the photograph with trembling fingers and found the luxurious linen real estate contract hidden directly underneath. She read the bold print detailing the $200,000 purchase of the exact dream home Gavin had endlessly talked about at dinner. She traced the ink of his signature standing proudly next to his mistress's name. In that agonizing and silent moment, the heavy illusions she had carried for 2 years violently shattered. The constant gaslighting, the emotional abuse, the financial terror, and the brutal isolation all suddenly made perfect sense. Gavin had not been failing because of a tough economy or a lack of support. He had been intentionally draining her lifeblood to build a hidden kingdom for someone else. A weaker woman might have collapsed onto the break room floor in a puddle of uncontrollable tears. A different wife might have immediately called her husband, screaming accusations and demanding an explanation. But Camille was my daughter, the blood of a man who built an empire from nothing, and a woman who never backed down from a fight flowed directly through her veins. The crushing fear that had paralyzed her for months instantly evaporated. The profound sorrow was entirely replaced by a freezing, calculated, and absolute fury. She did not shed a single tear. She carefully placed the photograph and the contract back into the black box and slid it into her tote bag. She returned to her desk and finished her shift with a terrifying robotic precision. She went home that evening and cooked dinner for Gavin, smiling at him with dead eyes as he complained about his stressful day at the office. She played the part of the submissive, obedient wife flawlessly because she finally understood the game. She knew that showing her hand now would only give him the opportunity to destroy the evidence. She became a silent predator inside her own home. The digital clock on my nightstand flashed midnight, casting a dim red glow across my dark bedroom. I was lying awake, staring at the ceiling and wondering if my daughter had the strength to survive the brutal truth I had forced upon her. Suddenly, my cell phone vibrated sharply against the wooden table. The sudden noise shattered the quiet night. I picked up the device and saw a secure, encrypted message from an unknown email alias. The sender was Camille. I opened the notification and found a massive, compressed data file attached to the brief message. She had not called me to cry or to ask for comfort. She had waited until Gavin was deeply asleep and systematically cloned the entire internal hard drive of his private laptop. She had successfully extracted every hidden file, every encrypted folder, and every secret banking password he possessed, along with his private communication logs. The text accompanying the massive data dump contained only 3 words: "Let us destroy him." I sat up in bed and immediately routed the massive compressed file to my secure desktop computer. The decryption process took less than 5 minutes. What unfolded on my glowing dual monitors was a masterclass in financial sociopathy. Gavin had meticulously organized his own digital execution. I clicked through nested folders containing scanned copies of the predatory loan agreements. There in high definition were the fraudulent documents binding my daughter to violent underworld syndicates. Gavin had practiced forging Camille's signature dozens of times on a digital drawing pad before applying the perfect replica to the binding contracts. He kept a sick, twisted ledger detailing every dollar he extracted under her name to funnel directly into the offshore account he shared with Morgan. I was reviewing a PDF of a threatening collection notice when my cell phone vibrated again. The caller identification displayed Camille's number. I answered on the very first ring. For a long moment, there was only the sound of her steady, rhythmic breathing on the other end of the line. She was standing in the dark hallway of the townhouse while Gavin slept soundly upstairs. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked with the heavy weight of 2 years of manipulation falling away. She said the word "Dad." It was the first time she had called me that since Gavin had deliberately engineered our estrangement. Hearing her say it broke my heart and simultaneously repaired it. I told her I was right here and that I had received the files. I promised her that Gavin would never be able to hurt her again. She replied with a voice as cold and sharp as cracked ice. She told me she did not just want to be safe. She wanted to obliterate his entire existence. We spent the next hour speaking in hushed tones over the encrypted connection, constructing a trap so flawless Gavin would walk right into it with a smile on his face. I needed Camille to perform the most critical and difficult acting role of her entire life. She had to return to the master bedroom, lie down next to the man who was systematically destroying her, and pretend absolutely nothing had changed. I instructed her to wake up the next morning and initiate a carefully orchestrated emotional breakdown. She was to tell Gavin that she had secretly visited my house completely desperate to save their marriage and his supposedly brilliant real estate venture. I told her to describe how she fell to her knees weeping and begging me to release the funds from my retirement account. She needed to feed his massive ego by claiming that her relentless tears had finally broken my stubborn resolve. I instructed her to tell Gavin that I had capitulated entirely and agreed to hand over the $200,000 cashier's check to fund his luxury dream home. Camille understood the assignment perfectly. She knew Gavin thrived on the illusion of absolute power and the complete subjugation of others. Hearing that he had successfully broken an old black man's pride through his wife's manufactured misery would be an intoxicating high he simply could not resist. He would not question the sudden surrender because his supreme narcissism dictated that he was always destined to win. I warned Camille that the next few days would be excruciating. She had to smile at him across the dinner table, listen to his arrogant bragging about the new mansion, and endure the sickening presence of a man actively plotting her total financial ruin. She assured me she could stomach his presence a little while longer because she knew the guillotine was already suspended directly over his neck. We synchronized our timelines down to the exact minute. She would deliver the fake news of my surrender at breakfast. I would then wait for his inevitable and gloating phone call to solidify the arrangement. We ended the call, not as a worried father and a terrified victim, but as a unified front of absolute destruction. The execution of our plan went off with terrifying perfection. By 9 o'clock the following morning, my phone rang with a call from Gavin. He did not bother trying to hide the immense smugness radiating from his voice. He adopted the magnanimous and forgiving tone of a victorious conqueror granting clemency to a defeated peasant. He told me that Camille had come to him in hysterics explaining my sudden change of heart. He claimed he was willing to accept my financial contribution as a formal apology for my previous disrespectful behavior at the steakhouse. His greed completely blinded him to any potential red flags. He was so desperate to secure the $200,000 and close the deal on his secret love nest with Morgan that he abandoned all rational caution. He believed his psychological manipulation had finally yielded the ultimate payout. Gavin immediately demanded that we finalize the transaction in a highly public and humiliating manner. He wanted to revel in his perceived victory and showcase his dominance to his entire social circle. He proudly informed me that he had booked a private dining room at the most exclusive and ridiculously expensive French restaurant in the city center for Friday night. He explicitly stated that he was hosting a massive celebratory dinner and had invited his parents, his siblings, and his closest business associates. He was orchestrating a grand spectacle to witness the exact moment I handed over my life savings to him. He wanted his wealthy white family to watch an elderly black carpenter bow his head and surrender his retirement fund to fuel his arrogant ambitions. He told me to bring the certified bank draft and wear something presentable so I would not embarrass his guests. I kept my tone perfectly submissive and defeated. I promised him I would bring the exact paperwork required to finalize the transaction and secure his future. I hung up the phone and allowed a dark, grim smile to stretch across my face. Gavin was actively building his own public execution platform and inviting an audience to watch the blade drop. His overwhelming vanity had guaranteed that his absolute destruction would not happen quietly behind closed doors, but in front of everyone he spent his miserable life trying to impress. I walked away from my desk and opened the doors to my bedroom closet. I reached past the faded flannel shirts and the worn denim jeans I wore to maintain my carefully crafted disguise. I pulled out the dusty garment bag containing the cheap, ill-fitting gray suit I had worn to the previous dinner. I stared at the cheap fabric for a long moment before tossing it directly into the trash can. I did not need to play the role of the defeated, impoverished father-in-law anymore. The time for hiding in the shadows and minimizing my presence was officially over. I reached for my phone and dialed the private number of an exclusive bespoke tailor I had not utilized in over a decade. I ordered a custom-tailored charcoal suit crafted from the finest imported Italian wool requiring an emergency rush order. Gavin wanted a grand spectacle to showcase his superiority. I was going to give him a show he would never forget. It was finally time for the real boss to step into the light. I stepped out of the private fitting room and stood before the towering trifold mirrors in the center of the upscale boutique. The master tailor quietly adjusted the cuffs of my crisp white dress shirt and took a respectful step back. The man staring back at me in the reflection bore absolutely no resemblance to the tired, retired carpenter who had walked into the steakhouse just a few days prior. The faded flannel, the worn denim, and the scuffed work boots were gone, completely discarded in the dressing room. In their place, I wore a stunning charcoal gray three-piece suit crafted from the finest imported Italian wool. The bespoke tailoring hugged my broad shoulders perfectly and commanded an immediate, undeniable authority. The dark fabric absorbed the light, making me look sharp, formidable, and entirely dangerous. I adjusted the heavy silk tie at my collar and fastened a pair of understated platinum cufflinks. For the past decade, I had deliberately hidden my immense wealth behind the guise of a struggling blue-collar worker to filter out the opportunists. Tonight, that disguise was permanently retired. The tailor handed me a sleek black overcoat and bowed his head slightly, recognizing that he was not dressing a man for a simple social event, but armoring a general for absolute war. I thanked him, paid the exorbitant rush fee in cash, and walked out the glass doors. The physical transformation was complete. The psychological shift had already happened the moment Camille sent me those stolen digital files. I was no longer a victim or a bystander. I was the executioner. I drove directly to Jonathan Pierce's downtown law firm, where my attorney was waiting in his dimly lit office with a stack of explosive legal munitions. Jonathan did not offer a handshake. He simply pushed a thick black leather portfolio across his mahogany desk. I opened it and meticulously verified every single document inside. The trap was armed with lethal precision. The first document was an emergency ex parte asset freeze authorized by a federal judge, permanently locking every single bank account Gavin possessed. The second document was a comprehensive divorce petition completely dissolving his marriage and stripping him of any claim to Camille's future assets. The third and most devastating document was a sworn criminal referral outlining his dozen felony charges, including federal wire fraud, identity theft, and interstate extortion. I closed the portfolio and slid it into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket. The heavy paper rested against my ribs like a loaded weapon. Jonathan poured 2 glasses of scotch and briefed me on the tactical perimeter. He had not just hired a standard security guard, he had contracted an elite private security firm staffed entirely by highly trained former military operators. 6 plainclothes agents were already strategically positioned around the perimeter of the exclusive French restaurant. 2 men were stationed at the valet stand, 2 were securing the rear kitchen exits, and 2 heavily built operatives were currently sitting at a corner table inside the main dining room, blending in perfectly with the wealthy clientele. Jonathan explained that men like Gavin are inherently cowards who operate purely on unchecked audacity. When an arrogant narcissist is suddenly stripped of his power, his money, and his public facade in front of his entire family, he becomes unpredictable and violent. The security team was given strict, undeniable orders. If Gavin raised his voice, they would stand. If he raised his hand toward me or my daughter, they would instantly and brutally put him through the floorboards. The net was completely and inescapably cast. Jonathan finished his scotch and went downstairs to prepare the transport. I remained in the quiet office for a few more moments, entirely alone with my thoughts. I reached into my trouser pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch. Inside rested the simple gold wedding band that had belonged to my late wife, Clarice. I held the smooth metal between my calloused fingers and felt a deep, familiar ache in my chest. Clarice had always possessed an incredible instinct for recognizing true evil. Even in her final days, lying in a sterile hospital bed, she had gripped my hand with a fierce, fading strength. She made me swear a sacred oath before she took her last breath. She told me the world was filled with greedy men who would try to exploit Camille's gentle nature. She demanded that I protect our daughter at all costs and never let anyone break her beautiful spirit. Clarice had looked me directly in the eyes and whispered that our family pride was not found in empty words, but in how decisively we finish our enemies. I took a heavy silver chain, threaded it carefully through the golden band, and clasped it around my neck. I tucked the ring deep beneath my crisp white shirt, placing it directly against my heartbeat. The cold metal quickly warmed against my skin, serving as a physical reminder of my sacred paternal duty. I was not walking into that restaurant tonight driven by petty malice or blind anger. I was walking in as a father fulfilling a dying promise to the woman he loved. I smoothed the lapels of my charcoal suit and walked out of the office with cold, absolute clarity. I descended to the private underground parking garage where Jonathan was waiting in the back of a sleek black executive sedan. I slid into the leather passenger seat and the professional driver smoothly navigated the vehicle through the bustling city streets. The ride was silent and tense, charged with the heavy anticipation of a looming catastrophe. The driver pulled into the circular driveway of the grand French restaurant and brought the heavy vehicle to a smooth stop. I looked through the tinted rear window and saw the brightly illuminated glass foyer. Gavin was standing right at the front entrance holding a crystal cocktail glass. He was wearing a flashy velvet dinner jacket and constantly checking his expensive watch. He looked out into the driveway and smiled a wide, arrogant smirk, completely eager to watch his impoverished father-in-law hand over a fortune. He thought his ultimate victory was arriving. He had absolutely no idea his total destruction had just pulled up to the curb. I stepped out of the sleek black sedan and handed the valet a crisp bill. The heavy glass doors of the restaurant were opened for me by a uniformed greeter. I walked into the grand foyer with the slow and measured stride of a man who owned the very ground he walked on. Gavin was waiting by the host stand with a crystal cocktail glass in his hand. The arrogant smirk that had been plastered across his face completely vanished the second he laid eyes on me. He expected the arrival of a broken and desperate blue-collar worker wearing scuffed boots and faded flannel. Instead, he was confronted by a towering figure draped in a pristine, custom-tailored Italian suit radiating absolute authority. His eyes widened in genuine shock as he processed my physical transformation. He swallowed hard and his grip on his glass tightened until his knuckles turned white, but his overwhelming narcissism quickly overrode his temporary confusion. He plastered a fake and overly enthusiastic smile back onto his flushed face. He clapped his hands together loudly and guided me toward the exclusive private dining room in the back of the establishment. Seated around the massive mahogany table was his entire pretentious family. His mother, his father, and his siblings looked up from their menus. Their expressions mirrored Gavin's initial shock. They had clearly been told to expect a pathetic charity case who needed to be spoken down to. I did not offer them a warm greeting or a polite handshake. I simply stared them down one by one. Gavin quickly raised his glass in the air and cleared his throat. He loudly announced to the entire room that the guest of honor had finally arrived. He practically shouted that the generous sponsor of his upcoming real estate venture was ready to celebrate. The private dining room was suffocatingly opulent, with crystal chandeliers casting harsh light over the heavy silverware and polished glassware. Gavin immediately launched into a frantic and breathless monologue. He dominated the entire conversation, speaking entirely to his wealthy family while gesturing wildly with his empty hands. He boasted endlessly about the prime location of his upcoming dream home and the exclusive gated community that would finally elevate his social status to match his boundless ambition. He described the custom marble countertops, the expansive entertaining spaces, and the massive professional kitchen he claimed Camille had always wanted to cook in. He painted a masterful illusion of a thriving marriage and a booming professional life. He repeatedly emphasized how this new property would serve as the ultimate launching pad for his corporate empire. He treated me less like a respected family member and entirely like a walking bank vault that he had successfully cracked open. He continuously dropped aggressive hints, loudly stating how grateful he was that I was stepping up to fulfill my paternal duties and secure his future. He eagerly asked if I had brought the certified bank draft so they could finalize the closing paperwork first thing Monday morning. I did not look at him. My eyes were completely fixed on my daughter. Camille was seated directly next to Gavin. She wore a beautiful dark dress, but she looked incredibly fragile. She remained absolutely silent throughout his entire manic speech. Her hands rested in her lap, but I could see her knuckles turning stark white as she gripped the fabric of her skirt with a quiet and terrified intensity. She was executing her role flawlessly, playing the part of the meek and obedient wife trapped in the shadow of a dominant husband. She kept her head bowed and her eyes glued to the pristine white tablecloth. She knew exactly what was hidden inside the breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket. She knew the execution was imminent, and the sheer anticipation was tearing her apart from the inside. Gavin completely ignored her visible distress. He poured himself another glass of expensive red wine and leaned across the table directly toward me. He clapped his hands together once more and aggressively demanded that we stop wasting time and get straight to the financial transaction. I did not rush to accommodate his arrogant demands. I slowly pulled out the heavy leather chair at the direct head of the table and took my seat. The position naturally shifted the entire focal point of the room away from Gavin and directly onto me. A nervous waiter immediately stepped forward with a bottle of vintage Bordeaux that Gavin had pre-selected to flaunt his supposed refined taste and deep pockets. The waiter hovered the neck of the bottle over my polished crystal glass, waiting for my approval. I raised a single hand and delivered a sharp, precise gesture. The waiter instantly backed away, understanding that I was refusing the drink entirely. I did not want any alcohol dulling my senses for what was about to happen. The sudden rejection of the expensive wine caused a heavy, uncomfortable silence to fall over the large dining table. Gavin's parents shifted nervously in their plush seats, exchanging deeply confused and insulted glances. The atmosphere in the room transformed from a loud celebratory feast into a tense and suffocating interrogation. I rested my forearms on the edge of the mahogany table and intertwined my fingers. I fixed my gaze exclusively on Gavin. My stare was completely devoid of any warmth or familial affection. It was the cold, calculating look of a predator locking onto its prey. I spoke with a low, gravelly voice that carried a dangerous and undeniable weight. The quiet tone forced everyone in the room to lean forward and listen to every single word I said. I ignored his frantic rambling about marble countertops and exclusive country clubs. I told him that before any financial transaction took place, we needed absolute clarity on the terms of this arrangement. I commanded him to look me directly in the eye and state the precise monetary figure he required. I demanded that he loudly and clearly articulate the exact amount of cash he expected me to hand over to secure this supposed dream home for him and my daughter. Gavin completely misinterpreted the coldness in my voice. His massive and fragile ego convinced him that my direct questioning was a sign of ultimate capitulation. He genuinely believed he had successfully broken me down and forced my submission in front of his entire family. He puffed out his chest and adjusted the lapels of his velvet dinner jacket with extreme arrogance. A wide and deeply repulsive smirk stretched across his flushed face. He leaned back in his chair and loudly declared the exact number so that every single person in the private dining room could bear witness to his absolute triumph. He confidently stated that he required exactly $200,000 to close the real estate deal and move forward with his perfect life. I did not blink. I did not break eye contact for even a fraction of a second. A chilling and deadpan smile slowly formed on my lips. The trap was now fully sprung. I reached my right hand slowly and deliberately into the inner breast pocket of my tailored charcoal jacket. My hand remained inside the breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket for a prolonged and agonizing moment. The entire private dining room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. The clinking of expensive silverware and the soft murmur of the waitstaff completely ceased. Gavin leaned forward with greedy anticipation radiating from his entire posture. His eyes were wide and fixated on my chest, completely expecting to see a certified bank draft emerge to fund his luxurious illusions. His wealthy parents stopped cutting their expensive steaks. His siblings held their collective breath. They were all waiting for the grand spectacle of my financial submission. They fully expected the elderly black carpenter to hand over his life savings to secure his daughter's place in their refined and superior world. I slowly withdrew my hand from my jacket. I did not pull out a leather checkbook. I did not pull out a silver pen to sign my life away. I held a single, neatly folded piece of thick legal parchment. I placed my hand flat on the polished marble surface of the dining table and pressed my fingertips firmly against the document. With a slow, deliberate motion, I slid that single piece of paper directly across the smooth marble. The crisp sound of the heavy paper gliding over the stone seemed to echo violently in the quiet room. The document stopped precisely in front of Gavin's empty dinner plate. He stared at it with a flicker of intense confusion crossing his arrogant features. This was not a standard bank check. It was a heavy legal document bearing the official blue seal of the state court system. I kept my eyes locked onto his face and instructed him to read the terms of his new arrangement. Gavin scoffed nervously and reached out to pick up the document. He acted as if this was some sort of outdated prerequisite or a stubborn old man's desperate attempt at establishing basic ground rules before surrendering the cash. He unfolded the heavy parchment with an arrogant flair, entirely ready to dismiss whatever trivial conditions I had drafted. He scanned the bold black text at the very top of the page. In an absolute instant, the smug, triumphant color violently drained from his flushed face, leaving behind a sickly, ashen white. His eyes darted frantically back and forth across the dense legal paragraphs. His hands began to tremble so violently that the thick paper rattled audibly in the dead quiet of the dining room. What he was holding was not a real estate contract or a simple list of financial demands. He was staring directly at a fully executed emergency ex parte asset freeze authorized by a federal judge. The document explicitly mandated the immediate and permanent lockdown of every single bank account, holding company, and financial asset tied to his name. It meant he could not access a single penny to hire a defense attorney to pay his commercial lease or to fund his hidden mistress. But that was not the only devastating paper folded in that stack. Right beneath the freezing order was a comprehensive and unforgiving divorce petition. The legal filing demanded an absolute dissolution of his marriage and completely stripped him of any future claims to my daughter's financial estate. Right at the bottom of the petition, scrawled in bold blue ink, was Camille's unmistakable signature. Gavin looked up from the paper with absolute terror radiating from his wide eyes. He slowly turned his heavy head to look at the fragile, submissive wife sitting quietly beside him. He realized that the meek and terrified woman he thought he had completely isolated and broken had just orchestrated his absolute financial and marital execution. The illusion of his absolute control was entirely shattered. He opened his mouth to speak, but his throat was completely dry. He tried to formulate a cohesive sentence to maintain his facade in front of his wealthy parents, but the sheer magnitude of his destruction left him entirely speechless. He was completely paralyzed by the realization that his carefully constructed empire of lies had just been violently demolished by the exact people he deemed completely powerless. I did not give him a single second to recover his breath or attempt to manipulate the narrative. I coldly informed him that he needed to turn to the third page of the legal packet. I watched his shaking fingers flip the heavy parchment. Staring back at him was a sworn criminal referral meticulously prepared by Jonathan Pierce and his elite team of corporate attorneys. The referral systematically outlined his dozen felony charges with absolute lethal precision. It detailed the exact dates and amounts of his federal wire fraud, his aggressive identity theft, and the massive $80,000 in high-interest predatory loans he had fraudulently secured under my daughter's name. The document explicitly stated that the comprehensive forensic financial evidence, including the forged digital signatures and offshore routing numbers, had already been forwarded directly to the federal authorities for immediate criminal prosecution. He was not just facing a messy public divorce and a permanently frozen bank account. He was actively staring down the barrel of a very lengthy federal prison sentence. It was at that exact moment that Camille finally moved. She did not cower. She did not weep or look away in fear. The fragile facade of the obedient and broken wife instantly evaporated into thin air. Camille pushed her heavy oak chair back and stood up incredibly tall. She looked down at the man who had subjected her to 2 years of severe psychological torment and relentless financial terror. She reached over and grasped his expensive crystal wine glass, pulling it firmly to the center of her place setting. Then she raised her left hand. Without breaking eye contact with the man who had destroyed her credit and betrayed her absolute trust, she slowly slid the expensive diamond wedding ring off her finger. She held the sparkling jewel suspended directly over the dark red wine. With a cold and final release, she let the ring drop. The heavy diamond hit the surface of the expensive Bordeaux with a sharp and highly satisfying splash, sending dark red droplets scattering across the pristine white tablecloth like drops of blood. It was the absolute and irreversible termination of their twisted union. She looked at him with profound, unyielding disgust and told him she was finally free. The sharp splash of the wedding ring hitting the dark wine broke the paralyzing spell holding the private dining room captive. Gavin's wealthy family suddenly erupted into a chaotic chorus of absolute outrage. His father shouted aggressive demands for an explanation, while his siblings forcefully pushed their chairs back from the table, ready to intervene. But it was Gavin's mother who reacted with pure, unrestrained venom. Her face twisted into a highly vicious mask of aggressive elite entitlement. She completely refused to comprehend that her precious perfect son was being publicly discarded and legally dismantled by people she considered vastly socially inferior. She lost all sense of aristocratic decorum and lunged forward across the elegant table with her hand raised high. She fully intended to deliver a vicious physical slap directly across Camille's face to punish her for her perceived extreme insolence. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I brought my large, heavy hand down against the solid mahogany table with the explosive, violent force of a sledgehammer. The deafening crack of my palm striking the thick mahogany instantly froze Gavin's mother in her tracks. She gasped sharply and collapsed back into her plush leather seat as if the physical sound had physically struck her across the face. My gaze locked onto hers with the cold, unyielding sharpness of a straight razor. I did not blink or offer a polite apology for the disruption. I projected absolute lethal authority, daring her to move a single muscle toward my daughter ever again. The chaotic, aggressive uproar from the wealthy family immediately died down into a terrified, suffocating silence. They looked at me with newfound terror, finally realizing that the quiet old carpenter they had spent the evening mocking was actually the most dangerous and powerful man in the entire room. I stood tall at the head of the table, commanding the space entirely. I reached back into my tailored charcoal suit jacket and pulled out a second heavy linen envelope. Gavin was still completely paralyzed, staring blankly at the divorce papers and the criminal referral sitting in front of his plate. I did not hand this new envelope to him. I tossed it directly into the center of the table where his arrogant parents and entitled siblings had a perfect, unobstructed view. I told them in a low, gravelly voice that since they were so incredibly eager to celebrate Gavin's grand real estate venture, they deserved to see exactly who he was purchasing the luxury mansion for. I commanded Gavin's mother to open the folder and look at the flawless son she was so desperate to protect. Her trembling, manicured hands reached out and slowly pulled the glossy contents from the heavy envelope. The first item that slid out onto the pristine white tablecloth was the crisp, high-resolution photograph provided by my private investigator. It clearly depicted Gavin standing in the bright lobby of the luxury real estate brokerage. His arms were wrapped tightly around Morgan, his 24-year-old secretary, pulling her into a passionate and undeniable kiss. The image was undeniable, absolute proof of his blatant and continuous infidelity. Gasps of pure, unfiltered shock erupted around the dining table. Gavin's sister covered her mouth with both hands while his father stared at the glossy image in absolute visceral disgust. But the devastation did not stop with a simple photograph of a sordid workplace affair. Directly beneath the picture was the fully executed purchase agreement for the $200,000 dream home Gavin had demanded I finance tonight. I pointed a firm, calloused finger at the signature line on the heavy legal document. I ordered the entire family to read the names of the primary buyers aloud, so there could be no misunderstanding. Gavin's mother stared at the dark ink and literally choked on her own breath. The luxurious property was not meant for Camille in any capacity. The CO owner explicitly listed next to Gavin's bold signature was his young mistress. The sheer magnitude of his monstrous deception hung heavily in the stale air of the private dining room. I laid out the truth with cold surgical precision so his family could hear every detail. I explained to the horrified audience that Gavin had spent 2 years shackling my innocent daughter to $80,000 in violent underworld debt just to maintain his fake lifestyle. I revealed that he had intentionally brought me to this expensive restaurant tonight to extort my retirement savings. He planned to use my hard-earned money to secure a hidden love nest for his secretary and leave my daughter completely bankrupt to face predatory loan sharks entirely on her own. The perfectly crafted illusion of the successful, faithful, and devoted family man was violently ripped away forever. The filthy reality of his sociopathic greed was laid bare right in the middle of their elite celebratory feast. Gavin tried to stammer a pathetic, panicked excuse. He frantically reached across the table to snatch the documents away from his family, but his father violently slapped his hands away. The patriarch of the family looked at his son with a mixture of profound shame and burning anger. I was not finished completely dismantling him. I had one final execution to perform to ensure he never manipulated another human being again. I reached into my jacket for the third and final time and produced the thick forensic accounting dossier compiled by Marcus and his elite team. I did not toss this file to the center of the table like the others. I walked slowly around the mahogany wood and placed it directly into the trembling hands of Gavin's mother. I told her that before she ever tried to defend her son again, she needed to look at his established historical blueprint. I watched as she opened the heavy cover and stared at the highlighted financial records from exactly 5 years ago. I loudly announced to the entire room that Gavin was not a victim of a failing startup or a sudden moment of financial desperation. He was a professional calculating con artist who specifically targeted the vulnerable elderly for personal gain. I detailed exactly how he had fraudulently acquired limited power of attorney over his own mother's retirement portfolio. I pointed to the copied checks showing his blatant forged signatures. I explained how he had systematically and mercilessly drained hundreds of thousands of dollars from her life savings, transferring her hard-earned pension directly into his personal accounts to fund his extreme vanity. The absolute shock in the room rapidly morphed into violent, aggressive outrage. His family physically recoiled from him as if he were carrying a highly contagious and deadly disease. His uncles, who had previously praised his business acumen, began shouting vicious curses at him across the table. His siblings glared at him with pure, unfiltered venom, realizing that their own mother's financial security had been secretly decimated by the very man sitting next to them. Gavin's mother wept openly, shedding the heavy, agonizing tears of a woman whose deepest and most humiliating secret was now public knowledge. She looked at the son she had fiercely protected all these years and told him with a shattered, exhausted voice that he was entirely dead to her. The public humiliation crashed down upon Gavin like a collapsing concrete building. The wealthy family that he worshipped, the high society approval he craved, and the sophisticated image he had sacrificed my daughter to build were permanently incinerated. He was completely stripped of his armor, his money, his marriage, and his entire family in less than 10 minutes. Gavin sat in his plush velvet chair, completely cornered and utterly destroyed. The walls of the private dining room were rapidly closing in on him. He had absolutely no money, no leverage, no allies, and no escape left. The stark realization that he was facing years in a federal prison completely snapped the last remaining thread of his fragile sanity. His manic eyes darted wildly around the room, looking at the disgusted faces of his parents, his furious siblings, and the cold, indifferent stare of my daughter. Then his unhinged gaze locked directly onto me. A dark and violent madness completely overtook him as he saw the architect of his total ruin standing calmly before him. With a sudden, guttural scream of pure animalistic rage, Gavin violently shoved his heavy chair backward and launched himself upward. He reached frantically across the white tablecloth and grabbed the heavy, serrated steak knife resting next to his pristine dinner plate. He gripped the wooden handle tightly and lunged straight across the dining room, aiming the sharp metallic blade directly at my chest for his ultimate revenge. The serrated blade never even came close to grazing my custom suit. Before Gavin could fully extend his arm or draw a single jagged breath to scream, his wrist was violently intercepted. The two heavily built private security operatives Jonathan had strategically positioned at the corner table moved with blinding and terrifying speed. They did not shout warnings or try to de-escalate the situation with verbal commands. They executed their standing orders with flawless military precision. One operative grabbed Gavin's extended arm, twisting it sharply backward until a loud, sickening pop echoed over the mahogany table. The steak knife clattered harmlessly onto the pristine white tablecloth. Simultaneously, the second operative hit Gavin right in the center of his chest, using his entire body weight as a battering ram. The impact lifted Gavin entirely off his feet. He flew backward and crashed violently against the polished hardwood floor of the private dining room. The heavy impact rattled the crystal glasses on the table and sent a shockwave of terror through his already paralyzed family. Before Gavin could even comprehend what had just happened, both security agents were forcefully pinning him face down against the cold floorboards. One drove a heavy knee directly into the center of his spine, while the other firmly restrained his arms behind his back. Gavin gasped and struggled wildly like a captured animal, spitting curses and thrashing his legs against the ground. He realized with absolute horror that his physical dominance was just as much of a pathetic illusion as his financial empire. He was completely pinned, absolutely powerless, and entirely at my mercy. I did not flinch or take a single step backward during the explosive takedown. I simply adjusted my silk tie and looked down at him with utter disdain. Jonathan Pierce stood calmly near the entrance of the private dining room and adjusted his glasses. He did not look at the writhing man on the floor. Instead, he raised his right hand and gave a sharp, subtle nod toward the main corridor. The heavy velvet curtains separating our private room from the rest of the luxurious restaurant were aggressively pulled aside. 3 federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters of the Financial Crimes Division emblazoned across their backs marched into the room. Their heavy boots thudded against the hardwood, matching the serious, uncompromising expressions on their faces. They were not responding to a sudden emergency call from the panicked restaurant management. They had been waiting patiently outside the building for the past hour. Jonathan had meticulously coordinated this exact sequence of events with the federal authorities. The agents had been actively monitoring the entire confrontation through a live encrypted feed tapped directly into the restaurant's security camera system. They watched Gavin boast about his fraudulent real estate purchase. They watched him open the divorce petition and the asset freeze. They watched him completely incriminate himself, and finally they watched him commit aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. They had gathered every single piece of audio and visual evidence required to ensure he would never see the outside of a federal penitentiary again. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with an absolute lack of sympathy in his eyes, stepped right over the shattered remnants of Gavin's pride. He looked down at the pathetic figure pinned to the floor and instructed the private security operatives to step back. The federal agents immediately took control of the physical perimeter. Gavin's family scrambled backward, pressing themselves against the expensive wallpaper, completely terrified of being associated with the monumental raid. His mother covered her face with her trembling hands, unable to watch the golden child she had protected for so long finally face the brutal consequences of his actions. The atmosphere in the room shifted from chaotic panic to cold institutional reality. The game was officially over. The federal government had arrived to collect its dues. The lead agent reached to his utility belt and pulled out a heavy pair of solid steel handcuffs. He grabbed Gavin's trembling wrists and forcefully jerked his arms backward. He did not read the Miranda rights with the bored tone of a routine traffic stop. He projected his voice loudly so every single wealthy relative cowering in the room could hear the exact nature of the monster they had celebrated. The agent officially declared that Gavin was being placed under federal arrest for 12 separate felony charges. He recited the lengthy and devastating list of criminal offenses with surgical precision. He listed aggravated identity theft, massive wire fraud, interstate extortion, and a highly coordinated scheme of federal bank fraud. Gavin thrashed wildly against the hard floor as the heavy steel cuffs snapped tightly around his wrists, biting deeply into his skin. The terrifying reality of a lengthy federal prison sentence finally shattered the last remaining fragment of his immense narcissism. He realized his charm and his tailored suits could not save him from the crushing weight of the United States justice system. He was violently hauled up to his feet by two agents, his knees buckling beneath him. His expensive velvet dinner jacket was torn and covered in dust. He looked frantically around the room, searching for a single sympathetic face. His parents looked away in absolute disgust. His siblings refused to meet his frantic gaze. He had no allies left in the world. In an act of pure, desperate cowardice, Gavin locked his tear-filled eyes onto my daughter. He began to weep uncontrollably, openly sobbing in front of the federal agents and his entire alienated family. He begged Camille to help him. He screamed that she was the absolute love of his life and that everything he did was simply to build a perfect future for them. He pleaded with her to tell the authorities it was all a terrible misunderstanding and that they could fix their marriage if she just gave him one more chance. His voice cracked as he desperately tried to weaponize her empathy one final time, hoping the gentle woman he had abused for 2 years would throw herself on the tracks to save him. Camille did not shed a single tear. She did not flinch at his pathetic screams or offer a single word of comfort to the man who had actively planned her total financial ruin. She stood incredibly tall, wrapping herself in an aura of absolute, untouchable dignity. She looked at Gavin with a gaze filled with such profound and absolute contempt that it physically silenced his desperate sobbing. She saw him not as a powerful husband, but as a weak, broken, and incredibly small parasite. Without uttering a single syllable, Camille smoothly turned her back on him completely, severing the invisible chains he had used to control her. She walked gracefully to my side and firmly linked her arm through mine. We did not look back at the ruined family or the shattered dinner table. We walked out of the opulent private dining room together, leaving the heavy, suffocating air behind us. The very last sound that echoed in Gavin's ears before we stepped out into the cool night air was the sharp, cold, metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking his wrists together forever. Exactly 7 days had passed since the heavy glass doors of the French restaurant closed behind us. The rapid and brutal dismantling of Gavin's entire life was executed with terrifying efficiency. He was no longer wearing a custom-tailored velvet dinner jacket or sipping vintage wine from a crystal glass. He was currently sitting on a rigid metal cot inside a cold concrete holding cell at the county correctional facility wearing a standard-issue neon orange jumpsuit. His highly anticipated bail hearing had been an absolute disaster. The federal prosecutor presented the mountain of undeniable evidence demonstrating his extensive flight risk and his deep connections to violent underworld loan sharks. The federal judge took less than 5 minutes to deny his bond request entirely. Gavin was remanded to federal custody pending trial with absolutely no chance of seeing the outside world. As he sat shivering in his sterile cell, a deeply exhausted public defender slid a thin manila envelope through the metal slot of his solid steel door. Gavin eagerly tore the envelope open, hoping to find a brilliant legal strategy or a lifeline from his wealthy parents. Instead, he found a devastating formal eviction notice. The document explicitly detailed that his fake logistics startup had been forcibly and permanently ejected from the commercial building. My private property management firm had seized the premises, completely changed the heavy brass locks, and discarded the remaining cheap office furniture into a dumpster in the back alley. He had absolutely nowhere to return to. The physical space he used to project his fraudulent corporate dominance was permanently erased from existence. The swift and catastrophic financial execution did not stop at his commercial eviction. The massive house of cards he had built entirely on my daughter's ruined credit score was violently collapsing all around him. The sleek, imported European luxury sedan he so proudly drove to assert his dominance was gone. A commercial repossession team had arrived at the upscale townhouse in the dead of night and aggressively towed the vehicle away, leaving behind only black tire marks on the pavement. The financing company had immediately seized the asset to recoup a fraction of their massive losses. His ambitious plans for the extravagant suburban mansion evaporated into thin air. The federal investigators had swiftly traced the fraudulent origins of his wealth and slapped a hard freeze on the earnest money deposit he had placed on the property. The $200,000 luxury dream home was officially placed back on the active real estate market, and his real estate contract was completely voided. But the final and most agonizing blow to his enormous ego came from the very person he had risked everything to protect. Morgan, the 24-year-old secretary and hidden mistress, did not stand by her wealthy benefactor when the federal agents raided their office. The very second she realized the federal government was seizing his assets and preparing massive indictments, she executed her own ruthless exit strategy. She utilized the secret banking passwords Gavin had so foolishly entrusted to her and completely drained the offshore account of its last remaining liquid cash. She packed a single designer suitcase and vanished into the city without leaving a single trace or a forwarding address. She abandoned him the exact moment his money dried up, proving that her affection was entirely purchased. Gavin was left completely and utterly destitute. He possessed no money, no property, no vehicles, and no allies. The man who had spent 2 years manipulating and isolating my daughter was now experiencing the absolute terror of true total isolation. He had absolutely nothing left to his name but a long list of severe felony charges. He sat on his rigid metal cot staring at the blank concrete wall, realizing that his arrogant ambition had systematically stripped him of every single thing he valued. The wealthy parents who had coddled him his entire life refused to accept his collect calls. He was a ghost long before he even stepped foot inside a courtroom. While Gavin rotted in a cold concrete cell, I was actively building a vastly different reality for my daughter. I drove my sturdy truck into the heart of the bustling downtown financial district. Camille sat quietly in the passenger seat wearing a sharp professional blazer and an expression of quiet anticipation. I did not take her back to the low-level administrative job she had been forced to work to survive Gavin's debt. I parked in the secure underground VIP garage of a towering glass-fronted Class A commercial skyscraper. We rode the silent private elevator all the way up to the penthouse executive floor. The polished stainless steel doors opened to reveal a massive state-of-the-art corporate suite featuring panoramic floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire city skyline. I walked her through the pristine reception area and stopped in front of a sprawling corner office. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a heavy brass key. I placed the cold metal firmly into the palm of her hand. I looked my daughter directly in the eyes and told her that this was the actual headquarters of my private real estate and asset management empire. I explained that I was not simply giving her a job to help her get back on her feet. I was officially handing her the operational reins to the entire kingdom. I had spent decades building this immense wealth in absolute silence to protect my family from predators, but it was finally time for her to step into her rightful place. Camille walked slowly into the center of the expansive office and ran her fingers across the smooth surface of the massive mahogany desk. She looked out over the sprawling city below her, taking in the breathtaking view of the world she now commanded. The transformation was absolute and undeniable. The terrified and indebted wife who had cried in a dirty supermarket parking lot was completely gone. Standing in the sunlit office was a powerful, wealthy, and incredibly dangerous corporate executive. She had survived the darkest trial of her life and emerged forged in pure steel. She turned to face me with a radiant, confident smile, completely ready to take control of her own destiny. We were standing together by the expansive windows discussing the immediate transition of the corporate accounts when the sharp vibration of my cell phone broke the quiet professional atmosphere. I reached into my tailored suit jacket and pulled out the device. The bright screen displayed an incoming call from an unknown local number. I pressed the button to accept the connection and brought the phone to my ear. A cold, automated voice operator from the county correctional facility immediately announced an incoming collect call from an inmate. The robotic voice clearly stated the name Gavin Foster. Camille noticed the slight shift in my posture and looked at me with a calm, unreadable expression. She knew exactly who was on the other end of the line. A weaker man might have simply ignored the desperate plea from a defeated enemy. I am not a weak man. I wanted to hear the exact sound of his absolute despair. I pressed the keypad to officially accept the charges and held the phone in absolute chilling silence, waiting for the broken man to speak. The line connected with a sharp, static hiss. Then came the sound of ragged, pathetic breathing. Gavin did not sound like the polished corporate executive who had demanded my retirement fund over an expensive steak. He sounded exactly like a terrified child who had finally been backed into a corner with absolutely no way out. He began to weep openly into the prison telephone. He sobbed so violently that his words bled together into a frantic and pathetic mess. He begged me to listen to him. He swore that he had completely lost his way and that the immense pressure of the business world had entirely corrupted his judgment. He promised to make full financial amends. He claimed he would dedicate the rest of his miserable life to repaying every single dollar he had stolen from Camille. He begged me to call Jonathan Pierce and retract the civil lawsuits. He pleaded with me to speak to the federal prosecutor and beg for leniency on his behalf. He asked for just one more chance to start his life over from scratch. He promised he would disappear and never bother my family again if I just unlocked his frozen bank accounts and let him hire a private defense attorney. I let him empty his lungs completely. I listened to his pathetic begging until his voice cracked and faded into a desperate whimpering silence. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or remorse. I spoke into the receiver with a voice as calm and unyielding as a stone wall. I told Gavin that a man who tries to build a mansion on the broken back of his own wife does not deserve a second chance at anything. I reminded him of the exact moment he stood on my front porch and threatened to lock me inside a psychiatric facility just to steal my property. I told him that his life did not end when the federal agents placed him in handcuffs. His life ended the precise second he looked at me and assumed my family was weak enough to be conquered. I informed him that there would be no deals, no mercy, and absolutely no salvation. I lowered the phone from my ear and pressed the red button. I severed the connection completely. I did not say goodbye. I simply erased him from our existence. 3 months passed with blinding speed. The federal justice system moves incredibly fast when a suspect is completely stripped of his financial resources and abandoned by his wealthy enablers. Gavin's high society family never attended a single court hearing. They legally distanced themselves from his toxic fallout to preserve their own immaculate reputations at their pristine country clubs. He was left entirely alone to face the absolute wrath of the federal prosecutor. I sat in the polished wooden gallery of the federal courthouse with Camille sitting tall and steadfast right beside me. Gavin was led into the courtroom wearing a faded orange jumpsuit with his wrists and ankles bound in heavy iron chains. His arrogance was entirely eradicated. He looked hollowed out and physically diminished. The federal judge did not offer him a shred of leniency. The gavel came down with a heavy and decisive strike. Gavin was sentenced to 8 consecutive years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. He was also ordered to pay massive financial restitution that would garnish any future wages he might ever earn. As the armed bailiffs grabbed his shoulders and dragged him toward the holding cells, he turned his head and looked back at us one final time. Camille did not look away. She stared right through him with absolute freezing indifference. He was a ghost to her now. With the toxic parasite permanently removed from her life, Camille completely transformed. She stepped into the role of chief executive officer of my asset management firm and dominated the corporate battlefield. The fragile, terrified woman who had been locked inside a townhouse was gone forever. In her place stood a fierce, highly intelligent, and absolutely untouchable corporate leader. She negotiated multi-million-dollar commercial acquisitions with the exact same cutthroat sharks Gavin used to pretend he knew. She wore sharp-tailored blazers and commanded boardrooms with an effortless authority that demanded immediate respect. The profound trauma Gavin had inflicted upon her did not break her spirit. It acted as an intense forge that tempered her into absolute, indestructible steel. I watched her lead a massive shareholder meeting closing a real estate acquisition that doubled our entire portfolio. I saw the brilliant reflection of her late mother Clarice shining brightly in her confident eyes. My daughter was no longer a victim. She was a conqueror. With the empire securely resting in my daughter's highly capable hands, I officially stepped back from the daily corporate warfare. I drove my reliable old truck back to my quiet neighborhood and parked in the familiar driveway. I walked up the creaking wooden steps and sat down heavily in my favorite vintage rocking chair on the front porch. The late afternoon sun cast a warm, golden glow across the manicured lawns and the quiet suburban street. I poured myself a tall glass of iced tea and let the profound silence of my sanctuary wash over me. I had fulfilled the sacred dying promise I made to my beautiful wife. I had protected our little girl from the vicious wolves of the world. I leaned back against the smooth, polished wood and smiled a deep and contented smile. Society often tells us that we must always be forgiving and that anger is a poison we must let go of. But I have learned a vastly different truth. When a predator walks into your home and attempts to devour the people you love, mercy is a foolish and fatal weakness. The absolute ruthless destruction of an enemy who threatens your bloodline is not an act of malice or an evil deed. It is a fundamental and necessary duty. The cruelty I unleashed upon Gavin was not born of petty revenge. It was a perfectly calculated and sacred cruelty. And looking at the incredible woman my daughter had become, I knew without a single doubt that I would do it all over again. I sit on this wooden porch and watch the evening light stretch across the pavement, and I realize there is one final profound lesson to be drawn from the ashes of Gavin's destroyed life. It is a lesson about the dangerous and intoxicating illusion of appearances versus the quiet, unshakable reality of true power. We live in a world that is completely obsessed with volume and entirely distracted by shiny, empty things. Gavin was the ultimate product of this superficial culture. He truly believed that wearing a bespoke velvet dinner jacket and swirling a $200 glass of imported wine somehow magically transformed him into a titan of industry. He thought that by projecting an aura of immense wealth, he could simply bend reality to his will. He leased luxury sedans he could not afford and rented premium commercial office spaces with money stolen from his own mother. He constructed a massive hollow theater of success because he inherently understood that society is fundamentally lazy. People see a young, confident white man in an expensive suit, and they automatically assign him competence, authority, and inherent value. They do not look beneath the surface to see the rotting foundation. Gavin weaponized this societal laziness. He weaponized the deep ingrained prejudices of the world to isolate and manipulate my daughter. But his greatest and most fatal miscalculation was turning that same arrogant prejudice toward me. When Gavin looked across a table at me, he did not see a man who had spent 4 decades navigating the brutal and unforgiving realities of commercial real estate and wealth accumulation. He saw exactly what his narrow, privileged worldview conditioned him to see. He saw an aging black man with calloused hands wearing faded flannel shirts and scuffed leather work boots. He saw a retired blue-collar carpenter who lived quietly in a modest single-story house in a working-class neighborhood. His immense arrogance created a massive blind spot that completely obscured his vision. He genuinely believed that my quiet humility was undeniable proof of my weakness. He equated my silence with stupidity and my lack of flashy designer labels with a total lack of financial resources. This is the ultimate danger of underestimating a person based entirely on superficial metrics. Prejudice is not simply a moral failure or a defect of character. It is a catastrophic tactical vulnerability. When you dismiss a man because he does not look like your fabricated definition of power, you voluntarily blindfold yourself before stepping into a battlefield. Gavin assumed I would be easily intimidated by his aggressive corporate vocabulary and his threats of legal action. He thought he could bulldoze right over me because men like him are rarely told no by people they consider socially inferior. He never stopped to consider that a man who chooses to drive a 20-year-old truck while possessing millions of dollars in liquid assets is a man who possesses absolute total mastery over his own ego. The The profound lesson here is that true generational wealth and genuine power do not ever need to shout to establish their presence. They do not require an audience or a grand performance. Clarice taught me this fundamental truth decades ago when we were just starting to build our hidden empire. She always said that the loudest person in the room is invariably the weakest because their noise is nothing more than a desperate shield to hide their profound insecurities. A lion does not need to roar to convince the jungle of its dominance. It simply commands the space by the sheer undeniable weight of its existence. Gavin spent his entire miserable life screaming for attention and demanding respect he had never earned. I spent my life quietly acquiring the very ground he needed to stand on. When the moment of absolute conflict arrived, his loud, aggressive posturing shattered against my silent preparation like brittle glass against solid granite. The absolute discipline of silence is the most terrifying weapon you can deploy against a narcissist. When Gavin stood on my front porch and threatened to lock me inside a psychiatric facility, every basic human instinct demanded that I scream back at him. My pride wanted to grab him by the throat and violently correct his delusion. But true strength is the absolute suppression of emotional impulse in favor of calculated tactical execution. By remaining entirely silent, I denied him the reactionary fuel he desperately needed to validate his victim narrative. I let his own unchecked arrogance push him directly into the focal lens of my security cameras. I gave him enough rope to completely hang himself. This same principle of emotional discipline is the exact lesson I had to impart to Camille. For 2 years, Gavin had systematically conditioned my daughter to react to his engineered chaos. He kept her in a constant state of exhausting anxiety, perpetually putting out the financial and emotional fires he deliberately started. He made her believe that her only value was her utility to his grand illusions. When the veil was finally lifted and the crushing reality of his predatory nature was exposed, Camille had to learn the agonizing difference between enduring abuse and actively destroying it. I could have simply handed her a check to clear the $80,000 in violent underworld debt. I could have hired a team of lawyers to quietly dissolve her marriage and shield her from the painful public fallout. But rescuing her from the immediate discomfort would have robbed her of the vital education she desperately needed. She had to feel the cold, hard sting of hitting rock bottom. She had to sit in that corporate break room and look at the photograph of her husband kissing his mistress. She had to confront the terrifying reality that the man she swore to love had forged her signature to steal money from violent criminals. If I had shielded her from the brutal impact of his betrayal, she would have remained vulnerable to the next charismatic predator who crossed her path. By forcing her to stand tall in that private dining room and drop her wedding ring into his wine, she reclaimed her absolute autonomy. She learned that establishing an unbreakable boundary requires the willingness to endure temporary agony for the sake of permanent liberation. She transformed her paralyzing fear into a cold, calculated fury that will protect her for the rest of her life. Furthermore, this ordeal illuminated the true purpose of accumulated wealth. Money in its rawest form is nothing more than printed paper and digital numbers on a bank screen. It cannot buy genuine affection. It cannot purchase basic human decency or construct a moral compass. Gavin possessed access to wealth and high society networks, but his soul was completely bankrupt. He was a hollow void, constantly consuming the energy and resources of everyone around him, simply to sustain his own fragile illusions. True wealth is not measured by the square footage of a suburban mansion or the brand name stitched into a velvet dinner jacket. True wealth is the absolute freedom to walk away from a toxic environment without asking for permission. It is the capacity to hire the most elite forensic accountants and the most ruthless corporate attorneys to construct an impenetrable fortress around your family. It is the quiet, comforting knowledge that you possess the necessary resources to completely dismantle the life of anyone who dares to threaten your bloodline. My money did not make me a better man, but it provided the exact heavy weaponry required to execute a flawless and devastating justice. It allowed me to transform my daughter's profound suffering into an absolute and uncompromising victory. Many people live their entire lives bound by the suffocating constraints of societal expectations and toxic familial obligations. They tolerate endless disrespect and relentless emotional extortion because they have been brainwashed to believe that the concept of family requires infinite unconditional forgiveness. They allow parasites to drain their financial resources and their emotional reserves under the false premise of maintaining domestic peace. But peace that is purchased with your own dignity is not peace at all. It is simply a quiet, prolonged hostage situation. The blood running through your veins does not grant anyone a permanent, unlimited license to disrespect your boundaries or exploit your generosity. Respect is the absolute mandatory currency of any relationship. If someone consistently refuses to pay that specific toll, you must have the courage to permanently revoke their access to your life. You must learn to look a predator directly in the eyes and completely sever their emotional and financial supply lines without a single ounce of hesitation or lingering guilt. The insidious nature of the white-collar predator is a crucial lesson for anyone navigating this modern world. Gavin did not use physical violence to break Camille initially. He used the slow, invisible poison of financial control and psychological isolation. The most dangerous abusers do not always arrive with clenched fists and loud threats. They arrive with charming smiles, grand promises, and a subtle, systematic campaign to separate you from your support systems. They isolate you so gradually that you do not even realize you are standing on an island until the water is already rising above your neck. Gavin actively encouraged Camille to quit her job under the guise of supporting his entrepreneurial dreams. He framed her financial dependence as a romantic partnership. He slowly cut her off from her friends, her colleagues, and finally from me. He created a closed ecosystem where he controlled the narrative, the resources, and the reality. The lesson here is that financial independence is not just a career goal. It is the ultimate survival tool. A person must always maintain their own fortress, their own hidden reserves, and their own unshakable grip on their financial identity. When you surrender your economic autonomy to someone who demands constant admiration, you are not building a marriage. You are actively signing your own enslavement contract. I think about the countless other victims who do not have a father with a secret $5 million portfolio to save them. The system is designed to protect men like Gavin. The banks issued those predatory credit cards without ever verifying Camille's physical presence. The real estate broker smiled and shook his hand while he flaunted a down payment built entirely on stolen funds. The legal system allows a man to file an emergency guardianship petition to steal an elderly man's home based on nothing more than a fabricated story and a tailored suit. If I had actually been the impoverished, vulnerable carpenter Gavin assumed I was, his plan would have worked flawlessly. I would be locked in a heavily medicated ward in a state-run facility, and Camille would be entirely crushed under a mountain of underworld debt eventually forced into bankruptcy, while Gavin lived in a $200,000 love nest with his secretary. This chilling realization is why my retaliation could not be measured or merciful. When a system is built to facilitate your destruction, your counterattack must be so overwhelmingly disproportionate that it shatters the very foundation of the attacker's world. The concept of familial duty is a double-edged sword. Gavin attempted to weaponize my role as a father, explicitly claiming that I owed him my retirement fund to elevate my daughter's social standing. He tried to exploit the natural instinct every parent has to see their child succeed. But a true father knows that throwing money at a parasite does not heal the host. It only makes the parasite grow larger and more demanding. Real parental duty requires the immense courage to stand by and watch your child endure the agonizing pain of a shattered illusion. It requires you to hold your ground while they hit the absolute bottom, knowing that the impact is the only thing that will finally wake them up. My cruelty toward Gavin was swift and total, but my apparent cruelty toward Camille, allowing her to discover the infidelity, forcing her to confront the massive debt, making her drop her own wedding ring into the wine glass, was the most difficult and necessary act of love I have ever performed. I had to let her break so she could rebuild herself with titanium. Now, when she walks into a corporate boardroom, she does not look for a savior or a charming visionary to lead the way. She relies entirely on her own razor-sharp intellect and the cold, unyielding boundaries she forged in the fires of her own betrayal. Let this story serve as a permanent warning to anyone who mistakes silence for ignorance and humility for vulnerability. Do not ever assume that a quiet life equates to a defenseless one. The people who truly possess the power to destroy you will never broadcast their capabilities or brag about their arsenal. They will sit quietly across the table from you, eating their steak, paying their bill, and analyzing every single weakness you eagerly expose. They will let you scream, let you threaten, and let you construct your own magnificent execution platform. And when the time is absolutely perfect, they will slide a single piece of paper across a marble table and watch your entire universe collapse into dust. If my journey has taught you anything about the absolute necessity of maintaining your boundaries, protecting your peace, and ruthlessly dismantling the toxic parasites who try to exploit your generosity, then I urge you to subscribe to this channel and share your own stories of survival in the comments below so we can continue to build an unbreakable community of strength.